The rain came down like judgment itself. Cold. Merciless. Each drop a tiny blade against skin that had already been stripped raw by words sharper than any claw. Liora stumbled through the forest, her bare feet slipping on moss-slick stones, her ceremonial gown, once pristine white silk, now mud-streaked and torn, clinging to her like a second skin of shame. The fabric had been chosen for her. By them. For a ceremony she was never truly meant to complete. Behind her, the howls rose into the night sky. Not the howls of celebration she'd heard just hours ago. No, these were different. Hunting howls. The kind that made prey animals freeze in terror before the inevitable end. And she, Liora, daughter of no one, Omega of the Silver Pack, had become exactly that. Prey. Her lungs burned. Every breath tasted of copper and rain and the bitter ash of humiliation that still clung to her tongue. She could still feel their eyes on her. Hundreds of them. The entire pack gathered under the full moon for the Alpha's mating ceremony, the most sacred ritual their kind had known for generations. She'd stood there in that clearing, surrounded by ancient stones carved with the names of every bonded pair since the first wolves walked on two legs and called themselves shifters. She'd stood there believing foolishly, desperately believing that maybe this time she belonged. And then the rejection had come. Not quietly. Not with mercy. Alpha Ronin had looked at her with those ice-blue eyes that had once seemed to hold warmth, had once seemed to see her as more than what everyone else saw. He looked at her in front of the entire pack, in front of the visiting dignitaries from neighboring territories, in front of the elders who determined the fate of their kind. And he'd spoken the words that unmade her. Unworthy. Cursed. Banished. The forest swallowed her now, branches reaching like skeletal fingers, tearing at the remnants of her gown, at her hair, at the last threads of dignity she'd tried so hard to hold on to. Thunder rolled overhead, a sound so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself, and lightning split the sky, illuminating the twisted path ahead for just a heartbeat before darkness crashed back down. She didn't know where she was running. Away. Just away. Away from the ceremonial grounds where her blood had been meant to mingle with the alphas in the bonding chalice. Away from the shocked gasps and satisfied whispers of pack members who'd never wanted an Omega like her to rise above her station. Away from her former den mother's pitying gaze and the cruel satisfaction in Beta Garrick's expression as he'd personally escorted her beyond the pack's boundary stones. The boundary. She'd crossed it 30 minutes ago, maybe more. Time felt strange now, elastic and wrong, stretching and contracting with each panicked heartbeat. Once you crossed the boundary, you were no longer pack. No longer protected. No longer anything but a rogue wolf waiting to be picked off by whatever dangers prowled the unclaimed territories between established packs. And they were coming for her. She could hear them. Close now. Too close. The hunting party Ronin had sent to ensure she truly left, to make certain she didn't linger on the edges of Silver Paw Land like some pathetic ghost haunting the borders of a home that no longer wanted her. Her foot caught on an exposed root, and she went down hard, palms slamming into mud, stones biting into her flesh. Pain exploded up her arms, but she couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. She pushed herself up, her hands shaking so violently she could barely make them obey, and kept moving. Kept running. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling the full weight of what had happened, and feeling that weight would crush her into something that couldn't get back up. The trees thinned ahead. She could see a break in the canopy, moonlight spilling through like a wound in the darkness. A clearing. Her mind screamed at her to avoid it, to stay hidden in the shadows, but her body was failing. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. Her chest heaved with sobs she couldn't quite suppress. She needed to stop. Just for a moment. Just to breathe. She burst into the clearing and immediately knew she'd made a mistake. The space was wrong. Too quiet. Even the rain seemed to fall differently here, slower, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. Ancient standing stones ring the clearing, not silver stones. These were older, covered in moss and symbols she didn't recognize. Symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint silver light that had nothing to do with the moon overhead. And she wasn't alone. The hunting party emerged from the tree line behind her. 5 of them. All male. All shifted into their beta forms, that dangerous in-between state where wolf and man merged into something built purely for violence. Their eyes glowed amber in the darkness. Their claws gleamed. Beta Garrick stood at their center, his lips pulled back in a snarl that might have been a smile. Liora backed toward the center of the clearing, toward the standing stones, her mind racing through options she didn't have. She couldn't shift. Her wolf had been silent since the rejection, withdrawn so deep inside her she couldn't feel the connection anymore. It happened sometimes when the shame cut deep enough. When the bond to pack and place was severed so completely that even the animal inside you couldn't find its way back to the surface. She was human. Fragile. Alone. The rain hammered down harder, plastering her hair to her face, and through the wet strands she saw Garrick take a step closer. Then another. The others fanned out, cutting off any escape route. They weren't here to escort anymore. She could see it in their eyes. In the way they moved. Predators circling wounded prey. Her back hit one of the standing stones. The moment her skin made contact with the ancient rock, something jolted through her. Not pain. Not exactly. It felt like recognition. Like the stone knew her. Like it had been waiting for her specifically to stumble into this forgotten place. Heat bloomed where her shoulders pressed against the moss-covered surface, spreading through her body in waves that pushed back the cold and fear and exhaustion that had been consuming her. Garrick's voice cut through the rain. Low. Mocking. He spoke about consequences and lessons and what happened to Omegas who got ideas above their station. He spoke about how the pack needed to be reminded of order, of hierarchy, of the natural way of things. She barely heard him. Because beneath his words, beneath the sound of rain and thunder and her own racing pulse, she could hear something else. A whisper. Many whispers. Coming from the stones. Coming from the earth beneath her feet. Coming from somewhere inside her own chest where her wolf should have been. The heat intensified. It started in her core and spread outward, burning away the numbness that had kept her moving through the worst moments of her life. And with the heat came something else. Something that felt like rage and sorrow and power all twisted together into a force she'd never felt before. Her hands began to glow. Faint at first. Just a shimmer beneath her skin, silver light threading through her veins like liquid moonlight. But it grew stronger with each passing second. The whispers grew louder. And somewhere deep inside, where her wolf had retreated, she felt something stir. Not her wolf. Something older. Something that had been sleeping inside her bloodline for generations, waiting for the right moment, the right crisis, to wake up. The hunting party hesitated. She saw uncertainty flicker across their faces. Saw them exchange glances. Garrick's confidence wavered for just a heartbeat before he forced his expression back into that cruel mask of authority. But that heartbeat was enough. Enough for Liora to understand that whatever was happening to her, they feared it. Enough for her to understand that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as powerless as they'd made her believe. The silver light pulsed brighter. The standing stones around her began to glow in response, symbols blazing to life, and the whispers coalesced into a single word she somehow understood despite it being in a language she'd never learned. Chosen. Lightning struck the tallest stone. The impact sent a shockwave through the clearing that knocked the hunting party backward, sent them sprawling in the mud. Thunder followed immediately, so loud it felt like the sky was tearing itself apart. And in that moment of chaos and blinding light and impossible power crackling through the air, Liora felt something inside her shift. Not her wolf rising. Something else. Something that made her wolf feel small by comparison. The storm intensified. Wind whipped through the clearing, and with it came a scent she didn't recognize. Pine and earth and something darker. Something that spoke of power older and deeper than pack politics and ceremonial rejection. The hunting party scrambled to their feet, their amber eyes wide now, their aggression replaced by something closer to terror. They ran. All 5 of them. Melted back into the forest like shadows fleeing the dawn. Liora stood alone in the center of the clearing, her hands still glowing with that impossible silver light, her body trembling not with fear anymore, but with the sheer force of whatever had awakened inside her. The rain continued to fall, but it didn't touch her. It evaporated inches from her skin, turning to steam that rose around her like a protective veil. She stared at her hands, at the light, at the proof that everything she'd been told about herself, that she was weak, powerless, beneath notice, had been a lie. Or perhaps not a lie. Perhaps she had been those things. Until this moment. Until the rejection had stripped away every illusion and left her raw enough for something ancient and true to finally break through. The standing stones pulsed with light in rhythm with her heartbeat. The whispers continued, but she couldn't understand them anymore. The language had become too old, too layered with meaning her human mind couldn't quite grasp. But she felt their intent. They weren't threatening. They were welcoming, acknowledging, confirming something she didn't yet understand but knew with bone-deep certainty was important. The silver light began to fade. Slowly, like a tide retreating from the shore. It sank back beneath her skin, leaving behind a warmth that felt nothing like the cold rejection she'd carried out of Silver Paw territory. Her legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees in the mud, no longer caring about the rain or the torn gown or the fact that she had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. She'd just scared off a hunting party of trained beta warriors with nothing but the light from her own hands. She'd just felt something wake inside her that the pack, that Alpha Ronin himself, had never sensed, never prepared her for. They'd called her cursed. Maybe they'd been right, but not in the way they thought. The wind shifted again. That same strange scent returned, stronger now, and with it came the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Not by something hostile. Not by the hunting party returning with reinforcements. This felt different. Calculated. Curious. Like whoever was out there in the darkness had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal themselves. Liora raised her head, rain streaming down her face, her green eyes scanning the tree-line for movement. Her chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but her instincts, newly awakened, sharper than they'd ever been, screamed louder. Warned her that the night's trials were far from over. That whatever had just happened in this clearing of ancient stones and impossible light was only the beginning. Something was coming. Someone was coming. And somehow she knew with absolute certainty that when they finally stepped out of those shadows, everything. Her exile, her power, her very understanding of who and what she was would change forever. The stones hummed. The rain hammered down. And Liora waited, alone but somehow less alone than she'd felt in years, for fate to make its next move. Because in the world of shifters and old magic and bloodlines that carried secrets through generations, some meetings weren't accidents. Some exiles weren't endings. And some young women who'd been called cursed and unworthy were actually something far more dangerous. They were prophecy waiting to ignite. If you're already feeling the pull of Liora's story, if your heart is racing right alongside hers, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because here at Shayla's Romance Library, we're just getting started. This is where the real magic lives. He stepped out of the shadows like he'd been carved from them. Not walking. Not exactly. Moving with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of absolute control over every muscle, every breath, every fraction of movement. The rain didn't seem to touch him either, or maybe it did and he simply didn't care. His dark hair was slicked back from a face that could have been beautiful if it weren't so severe. Sharp cheekbones. A jaw that looked like it had been cut from granite. Eyes that caught the silver light, still emanating faintly from the standing stones, and reflected it back like polished obsidian. Liora's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She tried to stand, tried to summon that silver light back to her hands, tried to do anything other than kneel there in the mud like some broken thing waiting for the final blow. But exhaustion had finally caught up with her. The power that had blazed through her moments ago had burned through reserves she didn't know she possessed, and now her limbs felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone weaker. Someone who couldn't fight anymore. He stopped at the edge of the circle of standing stones. Didn't cross the boundary. Just stood there studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Not the kind of awareness that came from fear, though there was some of that too. This was something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like recognition, even though she'd never seen this man before in her life. And he was a man. Definitely. Despite the predatory stillness, despite the way power radiated from him in waves that made the air itself feel heavier, he stood in his human form. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Dressed in black that seemed to absorb what little light penetrated the storm. Everything about him spoke of control. Of choice. Of someone who didn't need to shift into his wolf form to be the most dangerous thing in any given situation. The silence stretched between them. Not comfortable. Not peaceful. The kind of silence that preceded either salvation or slaughter, and she had no way of knowing which. Then he spoke. His voice was deep. Rough around the edges like he didn't use it often, or like he'd spent too many years growling instead of talking. But there was something underneath the roughness. Something that sounded almost like concern. Her name. He said her name. Liora. Not Omega. Not the cursed one. Not any of the 1,000 degrading titles the Silverpaw Pack had hung around her neck over the years. Just her name. Spoken with a familiarity that made absolutely no sense because she'd never met him, never seen him, never even heard rumors of someone who looked like this or felt like this, or made the very air around him bend to his presence. She found her voice. It came out rougher than his, scraped raw from crying and screaming and running through the storm. She asked the only question that mattered. Who was he? The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Something darker. Something that suggested he found her question either amusing or tragic or both. He moved then, finally, stepping across the threshold of the standing stones. The moment his boot hit the consecrated ground within the circle, the symbols flared brighter. The stones hummed louder. And that strange energy she'd felt awakening inside her responded, reaching toward him like it recognized something in his presence. He noticed. Of course he noticed. His eyes flicked to her hands where faint traces of silver light had begun to thread through her veins again, unbidden, unwanted. His expression shifted. Just slightly. But enough for her to see that whatever he'd expected to find when he came to this clearing, whatever he'd expected her to be, the reality was somehow both more and less than his assumptions. He crouched down. Slowly. Moving like someone approaching a wounded animal that might bolt or attack with equal probability. Close enough now that she could see details the darkness had hidden. The scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The silver threading through the black of his hair at his temples, marking him as older than she'd first thought. The exhaustion carved into lines around his eyes, the kind that came from bearing weight no one else could see. And the mark on his neck. Partially hidden by his collar, but visible when he tilted his head at that angle. A mark she recognized from the old stories, from the legends the elders used to tell before bedtime when she was young enough to still believe in fairy tales and fated mates and happy endings. The mark of an Alpha King. Her breath caught. Alpha Kings didn't exist anymore. Not really. That was ancient history, from the time before the packs had fragmented into territories, before the bloodlines had diluted and the old powers had faded into myth. The last true Alpha King had died 300 years ago according to the histories she'd read in the pack library during the long winter nights when she had nothing else to do but lose herself in stories about a world that no longer existed. But this man wore the mark. And the stones responded to him the same way they'd responded to her. And somewhere in the back of her mind, pieces began clicking together that she desperately didn't want to examine too closely. He spoke again. Said he'd been looking for her. Not just tonight. For months. Years maybe, though that part didn't make sense because she was no one, nothing, certainly not someone an Alpha King, if that's what he really was, would spend any amount of time searching for. She told him he was wrong. He had to be wrong. She was cursed. Banished. Omega-born and powerless except for whatever weird thing had happened with the stones, and she didn't even understand that yet. She had nothing to offer anyone, let alone someone who radiated the kind of power that made her borrowed silver light feel like a candle next to his bonfire. He shook his head. Slowly. Like he was disappointed but not surprised by her response. Then he did something she absolutely didn't expect. He reached out and touched her. Just his fingers against her wrist where the silver light pulsed beneath her skin. The contact sent a shock through her system that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the simple, devastating reality of human touch after hours of running and fear and complete isolation. But it wasn't just touch. The moment his skin connected with hers, images flooded her mind. Not her memories. His. Fractured. Incomplete. But powerful enough to make her gasp. She saw herself. But not as she was now, broken and muddy and exhausted. She saw herself standing in moonlight, silver flames dancing around her hands, eyes blazing with power she couldn't imagine possessing. She saw standing stones, these same stones maybe, and a gathering of wolves, hundreds of them, all howling in unison. She saw a crown made of what looked like solidified moonlight being placed on someone's head, and even though the vision was blurred, she knew somehow that the crown was meant for her. She jerked back, broke the contact. The visions vanished like smoke, but the afterimage remained, burned into her retinas, impossible to unsee. He withdrew his hand. Didn't apologize. Just watched her with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to the frightened girl hiding underneath the strange power and the ceremonial rejection and the desperate need to understand what was happening to her. He told her things then. Things that sounded insane. That the Silver Paw Pack's rejection hadn't been about her being weak or cursed. It had been about them being afraid. That Alpha Ronin knew, or suspected, what she really was, and that was why he'd orchestrated such a public rejection. To humiliate her enough that she'd run. To drive her out before she came into her full power and posed a threat to his authority. That the bloodline she carried, the one her mother had hidden from the pack records, the one that made her an Omega in name only, was older than the Silver Paw Pack itself. Older than most of the established packs. That her ancestors had been queens and warriors and priestesses who'd walked with the old gods before the world changed and forced the shifters into hiding. That she was supposed to have awakened years ago. That something had been suppressing her true nature. And that tonight, when she'd hit rock bottom, when she'd had nothing left to lose, the suppression had finally broken. And that he'd felt it. From 3 territories away, he'd felt the moment her power ignited. Felt it like a beacon calling him home to a place he'd never been but somehow recognized. Liora's mind reeled. Too much information. Too fast. Too impossible. She wanted to call him a liar. Wanted to tell him he had the wrong girl, that she was just Liora, just the Omega nobody wanted, just the reject who couldn't even shift properly half the time. But the silver light in her veins pulsed stronger with every word he spoke. And the standing stones hummed in agreement. And somewhere deep inside, where her wolf still hid, she felt something respond to his voice with a certainty that terrified her more than the hunting party had. The rain began to ease. Not stop entirely but soften, like even the storm recognized that this moment needed space. The Alpha King, and she found herself believing that's what he was, despite the impossibility, stood. Held out his hand. Not demanding. Not commanding. Offering. He said she had a choice. She could stay here, in this neutral territory, and try to survive alone until either rogues found her or her former pack sent a larger hunting party. She could try to join another pack, though that rarely went well for Omegas without references or connections. Or she could come with him. Let him take her somewhere safe. Somewhere she could learn about her bloodline and her power without fear of persecution or exploitation. He said he wouldn't force her. That he knew she had no reason to trust him. That he was asking her to make a leap of faith at the worst possible moment, when trust had just been shattered and safety was a word that no longer had meaning. But he also said something else. Something that resonated in a way that bypassed her logical mind entirely and spoke directly to that newly awakened power thrumming through her veins. He said he'd been waiting for her. Not for an Omega. Not for a weapon or a tool or a solution to whatever problems Alpha Kings faced in the modern world. For her specifically. For Liora. The girl with silver fire in her blood and a destiny she'd been denied since birth. And that if she came with him, he would make sure no one ever rejected her again. No one would call her cursed or unworthy or beneath notice. Because where he came from, what she was wasn't a source of shame. It was everything. She looked at his outstretched hand. Looked at the mark on his neck that proclaimed him something out of legend. Looked at the standing stones that had recognized them both. Looked at her own hands where silver light continued to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Behind her lay the silver alpaca. The only home she'd ever known. The place that had raised her and shaped her and ultimately cast her out. The familiar. The known. The pain she understood. Before her stood a stranger. A dangerous one. Someone who spoke of destiny and bloodlines and power as casually as other people discussed the weather. The unknown. The terrifying. The possibility of either salvation or destruction, and no way to know which until she made a choice. Thunder rumbled. Distant now. The storm moving on to rage over someone else's crisis. The standing stones pulsed one final time, bright enough to illuminate the entire clearing in silver light, and in that moment Liora understood something fundamental. She'd already made the choice. The moment she'd run from that ceremony. The moment she'd crossed the pack boundary. The moment she'd felt that ancient power wake inside her and hadn't immediately tried to suppress it back into silence. She'd already chosen to be something other than what the silver pack wanted her to be. This was just the next step. She reached out. Placed her mud-covered, trembling hand in his. The contact sent that same shock through her system, but this time she didn't pull away. This time she let the sensation wash over her. Warmth and recognition, and something that felt dangerously like hope. He closed his fingers around hers. Gently. Like she was something precious that might break if handled roughly. And maybe she was. Maybe they both were. Two people carrying burdens no one else could see, drawn together by forces older than memory. He pulled her to her feet. She swayed, exhausted and overwhelmed, and without hesitation he steadied her. His other hand came up to her elbow, supporting her weight like it was nothing. Like she was worth the effort. No one had touched her with that kind of careful respect since her mother died. He told her his name then. Spoke it quietly, like he was sharing a secret. Like names had power and giving his to her meant something significant. Damien. Not Alpha King. Not Your Majesty or any other title. Just Damien. A name that suited him. Strong. Simple. Ancient in its own right. She repeated it. Tested it on her tongue. Damien. The man who claimed to have been searching for her. Who claimed she was important. Who looked at her like she was already someone rather than someone she might become if she tried hard enough. The clearing began to fade. Not the physical space, that remained solid and real. But the significance of it. The crisis point. They were moving past it now into whatever came next. She didn't know where they were going. Didn't know what he really wanted from her or what learning about her bloodline would cost. Didn't know if she'd just made the best decision of her life or signed her own death warrant in a different form. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't alone anymore. And after years of being surrounded by pack and still feeling isolated, after tonight's ultimate rejection and abandonment, after running through the storm with nothing but her own breaking heart for company, that simple fact was enough. Damien released her hand but stayed close. Protective without being possessive. His eyes scanned the tree-line, checking for threats she couldn't see. When he was satisfied they were still alone, he looked back at her and something in his expression softened. Just barely. Just enough for her to see the man beneath the Alpha King. Someone who understood loss and loneliness and the weight of expectations that came with power you never asked for. Someone who might actually understand her. They stood in that clearing of ancient stones and dying rain, two souls who'd been walking separate paths through the darkness, now pointed in the same direction. Behind them, the past crumbled. Ahead, the future waited with all its terrible uncertainty. But for this moment, in this space between endings and beginnings, they simply existed together. And Liora, banished and broken and newly awakened, let herself believe that maybe, Just maybe, this strange, intense man with shadows in his eyes and legends on his skin might actually mean what he said. That where they were going, she would finally be enough. They walked in silence through the forest. Not back toward Silverpaw territory, Liora would rather die than return there. But deeper into the neutral lands, following paths only Damien seemed to know. Paths that felt ancient, worn smooth by centuries of paws and feet that had traveled them before the modern packs even existed. The rain had stopped completely now. The clouds broke apart overhead, revealing a moon so full and bright it turned the wet leaves silver. Everything glistened. Everything looked reborn. But Liora felt anything but renewed. With each step away from that clearing, away from the immediate crisis, the reality of what had happened began to sink in with crushing weight. She was banished. Packless. The word rogue kept echoing in her mind, carrying with it all the stigma and danger that came with that label. Rogues didn't survive long. They went mad from isolation, from being cut off from the pack bond that connected all shifters to their community. Or they were hunted down by territorial packs who saw them as threats. Or they starved because hunting alone was exponentially harder than hunting with pack support. Damien walked slightly ahead, moving through the forest like he'd mapped every tree, every stone, every shadow. He hadn't spoken since they left the clearing. Hadn't pushed her for conversation or explanations. Just led the way with quiet confidence while she stumbled along behind him, her torn ceremonial gown catching on every branch, her bare feet aching from cuts and bruises she was only now starting to feel as the adrenaline wore off. Her mind wouldn't stop replaying the ceremony. She couldn't help it. Every humiliating moment played on an endless loop, each repetition digging the shame deeper into her bones. She'd been so hopeful. That was the worst part. The pathetic, desperate hope that had bloomed in her chest when Alpha Ronin first announced the mating ceremony and told her specifically, that she would be considered as a potential mate. An Omega being considered for an Alpha. It was unheard of. Revolutionary even. The pack had buzzed with gossip for weeks. Some supportive, most skeptical, all watching to see what would happen when the lowest-ranked female dared to reach for something so far above her station. She remembered the preparation. The other Omegas had helped her, though their smiles had never quite reached their eyes. They'd brushed her long dark hair until it shone, woven silver flowers into the braids, dressed her in that white ceremonial gown that cost more than she'd earn in a year of doing menial pack tasks. They'd painted symbols on her arms and collarbone, symbols meant to invoke the blessing of the moon goddess on the union. She'd stood before the mirror in the preparation den and barely recognized herself. For the first time in her 23 years, she looked like she belonged. Like she was worth something. Like maybe all those years of being overlooked and dismissed had been leading to this moment when everything would change. The elders had called it a sign. Old Talia, the pack's spiritual leader, had pulled her aside the night before and told her that the moon goddess worked in mysterious ways. That sometimes the least likely candidates were chosen for the greatest destinies. That Ronin seeing potential in an Omega meant the old hierarchies were finally crumbling, making way for a new era where birth status mattered less than character and strength of spirit. Liora had wanted to believe it so badly. Had let herself believe it despite every warning sign, every whispered conversation that went silent when she entered a room, every calculating look from Beta Garrick and the other high-ranking males. The ceremony itself had been beautiful. The entire pack gathered under the full moon, arranged in concentric circles around the ancient bonding stones. The visiting dignitaries from neighboring packs had stood in places of honor, witnesses to what was supposed to be a historic union. The elders had begun the ritual chants. The sacred fire had been lit. And Ronin had looked magnificent. Every inch the alpha. Golden-haired and blue-eyed with the kind of physical perfection that came from generations of selective breeding. He'd worn the traditional alpha ceremonial leathers, marked with the symbols of their pack's founders. When he'd stepped into the center circle, every wolf present had felt the weight of his dominance press down like a physical force. She'd stepped forward when called. walked through the parted crowd with her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. The white gown had dragged through the grass, collecting dew, making her feel like she was walking through clouds. The silver flowers in her hair had caught the moonlight, and for those few precious moments, she'd felt beautiful, worthy, chosen. Ronan had watched her approach. His expression had been unreadable. When she'd taken her place across from him, close enough to see the pattern of amber around his pupils, close enough to smell the ceremonial oils the elders had anointed him with, she'd waited for some sign, some warmth, some indication that this was real. It never came. Elder Talia had stepped forward to bind their hands with the sacred cord, had begun reciting the ancient words that would open the bond between their wolves, would allow them to sense each other's emotions and thoughts, would tie them together in a way that transcended physical proximity. And that's when Ronan had spoken. His voice had carried across the entire gathering, amplified by alpha command. He'd said no. Just that at first. No. Simple. Final. The sacred cord had fallen from Elder Talia's hands. The chanting had stopped. Silence had crashed down like a physical weight. Then Ronan had explained. Had announced to the entire pack, to the visiting dignitaries, to the elders, to every wolf who'd come to witness what they thought would be a historic union, exactly why he was refusing the bond. He'd spoken about tradition, about blood purity, about how the alpha line must remain strong and untainted. He'd spoken about Liora's unknown parentage, how her mother had been an outsider accepted into the pack out of mercy, how no one knew what bloodlines she carried or what weaknesses might be passed on to future offspring. He'd spoken about her omega status as if it were a disease, had listed all her failures. Every time she'd struggled to shift, every task she'd performed inadequately, every social misstep she'd made in her years of trying desperately to fit into a pack that had never truly wanted her. And then he'd said the word that had shattered whatever remained of her composure. Cursed. He'd called her cursed. Said that the moon goddess had clearly marked her as unworthy, that her difficulty shifting was a sign of divine rejection, that binding himself to her would bring misfortune to the entire pack. The crowd had erupted. Not in her defense. In agreement. In relief that their alpha had come to his senses before making a terrible mistake. She'd heard their voices rising, validating every cruel word, adding their own observations about her inadequacy. She'd stood there in that beautiful white gown, with silver flowers wilting in her hair, and felt her entire world collapse. Beta Garrick had stepped forward then, had taken her arm, not gently, and escorted her from the ceremonial grounds. The crowd had parted for them, but she'd felt their eyes. Felt their judgment and satisfaction and relief that the natural order had been restored. Garrick had walked her to the pack boundary. Had very precisely explained that she was no longer welcome on Silverpaw Land. That if she attempted to return, she would be treated as a hostile rogue. That the hunting party would be sent after her in 1 hour to ensure compliance. Then he'd shoved her across the boundary marker and walked away without looking back. She'd stood there in the darkness, wearing a ceremonial gown meant for the happiest moment of her life, and felt something inside her break so completely she wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. That's when she'd started running. Liora stumbled over a root and caught herself against a tree, the rough bark biting into her palm. The pain brought her back to the present. To the forest. To Damien walking ahead of her. To the reality that she wasn't standing at that boundary marker anymore. She'd survived. Somehow. Though she wasn't entirely sure surviving was the same thing as living. Damien stopped. Turned back to look at her. In the moonlight his features looked softer, less severe. Or maybe that was just her exhaustion making her see things that weren't there. He asked if she needed to rest. The question was simple, but something about the genuine concern in his voice cracked something open inside her. All the emotions she'd been holding back. The humiliation, the grief, the rage came flooding up. Her throat tightened. Her eyes burned. She told him no. Told him she was fine. The lie was so obvious even she didn't believe it. Damien studied her for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He shrugged out of the dark jacket he'd been wearing and held it out to her. She stared at it, confused, until he gestured to her ceremonial gown, torn and muddy, and completely inappropriate for traveling through the wilderness. She took the jacket. Put it on. It was far too large, hanging past her thighs, the sleeves covering her hands completely. But it was warm. And it smelled like him, pine and earth, and something darker she couldn't identify. Something that made her wolf stir just slightly from its hiding place. He told her they'd stop soon. That there was a place not far from here where they could rest safely until dawn. That she needed to eat and sleep and let her body recover from the trauma it had endured. Trauma. He called it trauma. Not failure. Not punishment. Not what she deserved for being stupid enough to hope. Something in her chest loosened just slightly. They walked for another 20 minutes before Damien led her to what looked like a small cave mouth hidden behind a waterfall. The water wasn't heavy, just a curtain of silver in the moonlight, easy enough to pass through. Inside, the cave opened into a surprisingly spacious chamber. Dry. Protected. With signs that someone, probably Damien, had used this place before. There were supplies stored in waterproof containers. A fire pit with wood already laid. Blankets folded in a natural alcove. Damien moved efficiently, lighting the fire with practiced ease, creating a warm glow that pushed back the darkness and cold. Liora stood near the entrance, still wearing his jacket, still processing the fact that she was in a cave with a stranger who claimed to be an alpha king while her former pack probably celebrated her banishment. The fire caught fully, crackling to life. Damien settled near it and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated for just a moment before joining him, careful to maintain some distance. Her body was shutting down, exhaustion pulling at her like a physical force, but her mind was still racing. Damien pulled out supplies from one of the containers. Dried meat. Bread that looked fresh enough. A water skin. He offered them to her without comment, without any expectation of gratitude or subservience. Just simple care for someone who needed it. She took the food. Ate mechanically, barely tasting it, but feeling strength return with each bite. Her body had been running on adrenaline and fear for hours. Now that the immediate danger had passed, it was demanding fuel. They sat in silence for a while. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, night creatures resumed their songs now that the storm had passed. Everything felt surreal. Like she'd stepped out of her life and into someone else's story. Finally, Damien spoke. Asked her about her mother. The question caught her off guard. She looked up, found him watching her with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much. She asked why he wanted to know. He said because her bloodline came from her mother's side. Because whatever power was waking inside her had been dormant for so long that something or someone must have been actively suppressing it. And that kind of suppression usually started young, before the child even knew what they were. Liora felt her hands tighten around the piece of bread she'd been eating. Her mother. She hadn't let herself think about her mother in years. It hurt too much. But Damien was waiting. And somehow, in this cave lit by firelight with the sound of the waterfall creating a barrier between them and the rest of the world, she found herself talking. Her mother's name had been Liora. She'd come to the Silverpaw Pack when Liora was barely 2 years old. An outsider seeking asylum, claiming her previous pack had been destroyed by rogues. The Silverpaw elders had been suspicious. They always were with outsiders, but something about Liora had convinced them. Maybe her obvious desperation. Maybe the small child clinging to her leg. Maybe just mercy. They'd been granted provisional acceptance. Given the lowest-ranking position, Omega, and assigned menial tasks. Her mother had accepted it all without complaint. Had worked harder than anyone. Had tried to make them belong. Liora remembered her mother's hands. Always moving. Always working. Cleaning, cooking, mending, tending to any task that needed doing. She remembered her mother's voice singing old songs in a language Liora didn't understand. She remembered feeling safe despite their low status, because her mother had loved her with a fierceness that made up for every cruel comment from pack members who saw them as charity cases. She remembered the day her mother died. Liora had been 14. just starting to feel the first stirrings of her wolf trying to emerge. Just beginning to understand the complexities of pack hierarchy and her place at the bottom of it. Her mother had taken ill suddenly. A fever that came on fast and burned hot. The pack healer had done what she could, but it wasn't enough. In her final hours, delirious with fever, Liora had grabbed Liora's hand and spoken frantically in that language Liora had never learned. Had traced symbols on Liora's arms that glowed faintly silver before fading. Had pressed something into Liora's palm, a small pendant on a delicate chain, shaped like a crescent moon with strange markings Liora couldn't read. Then Liora had whispered one final thing in the common tongue, her voice barely audible. Don't let them see. Hide what you are. Stay small. Stay safe. Hours later, she was gone. The pack had burned her body according to shifter custom. Liora had stood there at 14 years old, watching the flames consume the only person who'd ever loved her unconditionally, and felt something inside her close off. Locked down. Become small and hidden just like her mother had begged her to be. She'd worn the pendant every day since. Hidden under her clothes where no one could see it. The only connection to a mother whose past remained a mystery, whose bloodline Liora knew nothing about, whose final words had been a warning to hide. Liora's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, feeling for the pendant's familiar weight. But it wasn't there. She'd lost it. Somewhere in the run through the forest, or maybe when the hunting party had attacked, or possibly when that silver light had exploded through her in the clearing. The one thing she had left of her mother was gone. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She made a sound, half gasp, half sob, and pressed her hand harder against her throat as if she could somehow will the pendant back into existence. Damien moved closer. Not touching, but present. His voice was gentle when he spoke, telling her that losing a physical token didn't mean losing the connection. That her mother's legacy lived in her blood, in the power that was finally awakening, in the strength it took to survive what she'd survived tonight. Liora shook her head. He didn't understand. Her mother had told her to hide. To stay small. To stay safe. And what had Liora done? Gotten herself banished. Revealed whatever power this was in front of a hunting party. Let herself be led into the wilderness by a strange alpha king who claimed she was someone important. She'd failed at the one thing her mother had asked of her. Damien was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made her look up at him through tear-blurred eyes. He said that maybe her mother's warning had been necessary when Liora was young and vulnerable, when the pack might have feared her power enough to eliminate the threat. But that Liora wasn't 14 anymore. Wasn't a child who needed to hide. She was a grown woman whose power had chosen this moment, this crisis, to finally emerge. And maybe, just maybe, that meant the time for hiding was over. Liora wanted to argue. Wanted to explain that she wasn't ready for any of this. That she didn't know how to be whatever he thought she was. That she was terrified of this power burning through her veins, of the way the standing stones had responded to her, of the visions she'd seen when Damien touched her hand. But she was also exhausted. Bone deep, soul tired, exhausted. The kind of tiredness that came from years of trying to be small, trying to be acceptable, trying to earn love and belonging from people who would never give it freely. Damien stood and retrieved one of the blankets from the alcove. He handed it to her, then moved to the opposite side of the fire, giving her space. Giving her the choice of proximity or distance. He settled against the cave wall, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and told her to sleep. That he would keep watch. That she was safe here. Safe. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt truly safe. But as she wrapped the blanket around herself and lay down near the fire's warmth, wearing Damien's jacket that smelled like protection and possibility, she found herself wanting to believe him. Her eyes grew heavy. The fire crackled. And as consciousness began to slip away, Liora's last thought was of her mother's face. Not sick and fevered, but healthy and smiling, the way she'd looked in Liora's earliest memories. And, somehow she knew, felt it with bone-deep certainty. That wherever Alera's spirit was now, she wasn't disappointed. She was watching. Waiting. hoping her daughter would finally understand that some things were worth revealing, even if revealing them meant stepping into danger. Some truths were worth the risk of being seen. Dawn came softly to the forest, filtering through the waterfall in ribbons of pale gold that turned the cave into something otherworldly. Liora woke to the sound of water and birdsong, her body still heavy with exhaustion, but her mind sharper than it had been in hours. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came crashing back. The ceremony, the rejection, the run through the storm, the silver light. Damien. She sat up slowly, the blanket falling away, and found him exactly where he'd been when she'd fallen asleep. Awake. Watching the cave entrance with the kind of vigilant stillness that suggested he hadn't rested at all. He looked different in the morning light. Less intimidating. The shadows that had made him seem carved from darkness had softened, revealing the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He noticed her movement and turned. His eyes met hers and something passed between them. Not words. Not even understanding exactly. Just recognition. Two people who'd survived the night and somehow found themselves on the other side of catastrophe, still breathing. Damien stood and moved toward her, his movements careful, measured. He handed her a water skin, and she drank gratefully, the cool liquid soothing her raw throat. When she'd had enough, she handed it back and forced herself to ask the question that had been burning in her mind since she'd fallen asleep. Where were they going? Damien settled back against the cave wall, his gaze steady on hers. He told her about a place called Mufel Sanctuary, an ancient site hidden deep in the unclaimed territories, older than any of the modern pacts, older than the recorded histories most shifters learned. A place where the first wolves had gathered when they still walked with the gods. Where the boundaries between worlds grew thin and the old magic still pulsed through the earth like a heartbeat. He said it was 3 days' journey from here. That they would need to move carefully, avoiding pact territories and rogue bands that prowled the neutral lands. That once they arrived, she would begin to understand what she really was. What her mother had been trying to protect her from. What that silver light meant and why it had chosen this moment to wake. Liora felt her chest tighten. She asked the question she'd been afraid to voice. What if she didn't want to know? What if whatever was inside her was too dangerous? Too powerful? What if her mother had been right to tell her to hide? Damien's expression shifted. Something like understanding crossed his features, softening the severity that usually defined him. He told her that fear was natural. That power without understanding was dangerous. But that hiding from what you were didn't make you safer. It just made you a target for those who could sense your potential and wanted to control it or eliminate it before it became a threat. He told her that Alpha Ronin had known. Maybe not the specifics, but he'd sensed something in her that frightened him. That's why the rejection had been so public, so humiliating. He'd wanted to break her spirit completely, to drive her so far away that whatever power slept inside her would never have the chance to wake. The ceremony hadn't been about considering her as a mate. It had been a trap designed to crush her before she became dangerous. The words hit Liora like physical blows. She'd suspected some of this in the darkest corners of her mind, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach twist with rage and grief. Ronin had never intended to bond with her. He'd used her hope, her desperate need to belong, as a weapon against her. The entire pack had watched him destroy her, and they'd either been in on the deception or too blind to see it. Damien continued speaking, his voice low and steady, telling her things that sounded like stories from the elder tales she'd grown up hearing. He spoke of bloodlines that carried divine favor, of women who'd been called Mu-born because they channeled the goddess's power directly. He spoke of queens who'd ruled not through physical strength, but through magic so profound it could heal entire territories or raise them to ash depending on their will. He told her that her mother's bloodline, her bloodline, was one of the last remaining Mu-born lines. That most had been hunted to extinction centuries ago when the packs fragmented and males seized power through brute force rather than divine right. That the old ways had been suppressed, buried under new traditions that favored physical dominance over spiritual connection. That she was dangerous not because she was weak, but because she represented everything the modern alpha hierarchies had tried to erase. Leora's hands began to tremble. She looked down at her palms, half expecting to see that silver light threading through her veins again. But her skin looked normal. Human. Unremarkable. She told Damien he had to be wrong. That she couldn't be what he was describing. She'd lived 23 years as an Omega, barely able to shift, barely able to defend herself. If she had this supposed power, wouldn't she have known? Wouldn't it have shown itself before last night? Damien shook his head slowly. He explained that Mu-born children were usually identified young and trained by their mothers or other women who carried the knowledge. But Leora's mother had been in hiding, running from someone who wanted her dead. She would have done everything possible to suppress Leora's gifts, to keep her daughter invisible until she was old enough and strong enough to protect herself. The binding symbols Liora had traced on Leora's arms in her final moments, those weren't blessings. They were suppression wards. Her mother had used the last of her strength to reinforce the magical locks she'd placed on Leora's power years earlier, to keep her daughter safe just a little longer. But suppression magic only worked until a critical emotional threshold was reached. Until the person being bound experienced trauma so severe their spirit simply couldn't contain the power anymore. Last night, standing in that clearing with a hunting party closing in and nowhere left to run, Liora had finally broken through every ward her mother had carefully constructed. The power hadn't chosen that moment to wake. It had been there all along, fighting to emerge, waiting for the moment when Leora's need was greater than her fear. Liora felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She asked Damien how he knew all this. How he could be so certain about her bloodline when even she knew nothing about her mother's past. When the Silverpaw Pack records had listed Liora as a simple refugee with no notable lineage, Damien was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight that made the air in the cave feel heavier. He told her he'd been searching for surviving Moonborn bloodlines for 15 years. That is Alpha King, and yes, that's what he was. Though the title meant different things now than it had in ancient times, it was his responsibility to protect what remained of the old ways. To find those who carried divine blood and keep them safe from those who would exploit or destroy them. He told her he'd felt her mother's death. Felt the moment Alara's power had flickered out like a candle in the wind. He'd sent scouts to investigate, but by the time they reached Silverpaw territory, Liora had already been absorbed into the Pax Omega ranks, her gifts suppressed so thoroughly there was no trace of them. He'd watched from a distance for years, waiting, hoping she would manifest something that would confirm what he suspected. And then last night, he'd felt her power ignite like a beacon visible across 3 territories. He'd been traveling nearby on other business when the surge hit him with such force he'd nearly collapsed. He'd known immediately what it meant. A Mu-born had awakened. And based on the location and intensity, he'd known it had to be her. Liora stared at him, trying to process the implications. He'd known about her for years. Had been watching. Waiting. The thought should have made her angry, should have felt like another violation of her privacy, another person manipulating her from the shadows. But instead she felt something closer to relief. That someone had seen her. That she hadn't been as invisible as she'd believed. She asked why he hadn't approached her sooner. Why let her suffer in the Silverpaw Pack if he'd known what she was? Damien's expression grew troubled. He admitted he'd made mistakes. That he'd underestimated how thoroughly Liora had suppressed Leora's gifts. That he thought the power would manifest naturally as Liora matured, that he'd be able to step in then and offer protection. He hadn't anticipated Ronan would sense something and decide to eliminate the potential threat through social destruction rather than physical violence. He told her he was sorry. That if he'd known what Ronan was planning with that ceremony, he would have intervened sooner. That watching her run through the storm, hunted and terrified, had been one of the hardest things he'd ever forced himself to endure while waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. The apology hung in the air between them. Liora didn't know what to do with it. Part of her wanted to rage at him for not saving her from years of humiliation and loneliness. But another part, the part that was slowly waking up to the reality of her situation, Understood that some things had to unfold in their own time. That maybe she needed to break completely before she could rebuild herself into something stronger. Damien stood and moved toward the cave entrance, checking the waterfall beyond for any signs of danger. When he seemed satisfied they were still alone, he turned back to her and said it was time to leave. That they needed to reach Mufel Sanctuary before word of last night's events spread too far. Before Ronan realized what he'd actually unleashed and sent more than just a hunting party to deal with the problem. Liora forced herself to stand despite her protesting muscles. Her body ached in ways she'd never experienced, every movement a reminder of the night's trauma. She still wore Damien's jacket over the ruined ceremonial gown. Still felt the absence of her mother's pendant like a wound. Still didn't fully understand or accept what Damien was telling her about bloodlines and prophecies and ancient power. But she followed him anyway. Because what else could she do? Return to Silverpaw and beg for forgiveness? Find another pack and hope they'd accept a banished Omega with mysterious powers she couldn't control? Try to survive alone in the wilderness with no resources and no training? At least with Damien she had answers. Or the promise of answers. At least with him she wasn't completely alone. They left the cave and plunged back into the forest. The morning was beautiful, clear sky, warm sun filtering through the canopy, birds calling to each other in the branches above. It felt wrong somehow. Like the world should reflect the chaos of the night before. Like nature itself should be grieving for everything she'd lost. But the forest didn't care about her pain. It simply existed, indifferent and eternal, while she walked through it trying to piece together an identity that had been shattered and reformed in the space of a single night. They walked for hours. Damien set a steady pace that pushed her endurance, but didn't break her. He seemed to know exactly when to slow down, when to stop for water, when to give her a moment to catch her breath without making her feel weak for needing it. He navigated the wilderness with the confidence of someone who'd walked these paths countless times, avoiding areas that felt too exposed, choosing routes that kept them hidden beneath the forest canopy. Around midday they came to a stream. Clear water rushing over smooth stones, creating a sound that was almost musical. Damien told her they would rest here briefly, that she should drink and clean her wounds. The cuts on her feet had begun to throb with each step, and she hadn't realized how much mud and blood had dried on her skin until she saw her reflection in the water. She looked like something that had crawled out of a nightmare. Hair matted and tangled. Face streaked with dirt and dried tears. The remains of the ceremonial gown hanging off her in muddy shreds beneath Damien's jacket. She barely recognized herself. She knelt by the stream and splashed cold water on her face, washing away layers of grime. The shock of cold helped clear her mind. She looked at her hands again, studying her palms like they belonged to someone else. These hands had glowed with silver light, had somehow driven off 5 trained warriors, had connected with ancient standing stones that recognized what she was before she did. Damien crouched beside her. He pulled a small cloth from his pack and dipped it in the stream, then handed it to her without comment. She took it gratefully and continued cleaning herself up as best she could. When she finished, she noticed him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He told her they were close to a threshold. Not a physical boundary, but a spiritual one. That the closer they got to Mufel Sanctuary, the more she would begin to feel her power responding to the ancient magic saturated in that place. That it might be uncomfortable. Might even be painful as her gifts fully awakened without the suppression wards holding them back. He told her he would help her through it. That she wouldn't be alone. Liora wanted to believe him. Wanted to trust that this stranger who claimed to be an Alpha King actually had her best interests at heart and wasn't leading her into a different kind of trap. But trust had been broken so thoroughly last night that she didn't know how to rebuild it. Not yet. Still, she nodded. Acknowledged his words even if she couldn't fully accept them. And when they stood to continue walking, she noticed something new. The forest felt different here. Not threatening exactly, but aware. Like the trees themselves were watching their passage, judging whether they belonged. The air tasted different too, cleaner somehow, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle and her newly awakened instincts sharpen. Damien noticed her reaction. He told her they'd just crossed into what the old wolves called the Threshold Lands. Territory that belonged to no pack because the magic here was too strong, too unpredictable for most shifters to tolerate. Only those with significant power or ancient bloodlines could walk these paths without losing themselves to the pull of the old ways. The fact that she could feel it, that her body was responding to the change in atmosphere, was proof of what she carried in her blood. They walked deeper into the Threshold Lands as the day stretched toward afternoon. The forest grew denser, the trees older and more massive. Some of them looked like they'd been standing for centuries, their trunks so wide it would take 5 people holding hands to encircle them. Moss grew thick on every surface, glowing faintly with bioluminescence despite the sunlight. Strange flowers bloomed in impossible colors, silver and gold, and a blue so deep it looked almost black. And then she began to see the stones. Not standing stones like the ones from last night, but smaller markers. Ancient and weathered, partially hidden by undergrowth, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when she looked directly at them. Damien explained these were waymarkers left by the first wolves, pointing the way to sacred sites for those who knew how to read them. Liora found herself drawn to them. Each time they passed one, she felt a pull in her chest, a warmth that started where her heart beat and spread outward through her limbs. The silver light wanted to respond, wanted to reach out and connect with whatever power had been carved into those ancient stones. Damien watched her carefully, but said nothing. Just let her experience the sensations without pushing or explaining too much. Like he understood that some things had to be felt rather than intellectually understood. As the afternoon wore on, Liora's awareness of her own power grew stronger. She could feel it now, not just as silver light, but as a living presence coiled in her core. It had a personality of sorts, fierce and protective but also cautious, like it had learned to hide over the years and wasn't entirely sure it was safe to emerge fully. She tried to communicate with it the way she'd been taught to communicate with her wolf. But this wasn't her wolf. Her wolf was still there, still hiding, still traumatized by the rejection and everything that had followed. This power was something else entirely. Something older that existed alongside her wolf rather than being part of it. Damien called a halt as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. They'd reached a small clearing where another waymarker stood, this one larger than the others. More elaborate. The symbols carved into its surface glowed with that same faint silver light that had come from her hands. He told her they would camp here for the night. That tomorrow they would reach Mufel Sanctuary. That she should rest and prepare herself, because once they crossed that final threshold, her transformation would begin in earnest. Liora felt fear spike through her chest. Transformation. The word carried weight. Implied change she couldn't take back. She asked what would happen to her. If she would still be herself when it was done. Damien moved close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. He told her that power didn't erase who you were. It revealed it. That she would always be Liora, the girl who'd survived years of dismissal and cruelty, who'd run through a storm with a hunting party on her heels, who'd had the courage to take a stranger's hand when every rational thought screamed at her to run. But she would also become more. Would understand the full scope of what she'd been born to be. Would step into a legacy that had been denied to her for far too long. He told her she was stronger than she knew. That she'd already proven that by surviving last night. That whatever came next, she would survive that too. The sincerity in his voice nearly broke something in her. She turned away, not wanting him to see the tears that threatened again. She was so tired of crying. Tired of feeling weak and lost and overwhelmed. She wanted to be the person he seemed to see when he looked at her. The person with silver fire in her blood and ancient power waiting to be claimed. But she wasn't there yet. And she didn't know if she ever would be. Damien began setting up camp with the same efficient movements he'd shown in the cave. He built a fire, laid out supplies, created a space that felt secure despite being surrounded by wild magic and ancient forest. And through it all, he gave her room to process. To sit with her thoughts and fears. to exist in her uncertainty without trying to force her into acceptance before she was ready. As darkness fell and the fire crackled to life, Liora found herself thinking about prophecy, about destiny, about all those old stories where young women discovered they were special and went on to save kingdoms or break curses or fulfill ancient predictions. Those stories always made it sound inevitable. Like the heroine just naturally stepped into her power and everything fell into place. But sitting here in the threshold lands with silver light pulsing beneath her skin and fear twisting her stomach into knots, Liora understood that destiny didn't feel inevitable. It felt terrifying. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff and being asked to jump with no guarantee there would be anything to catch her fall. Damien settled across the fire from her, his face half in shadow. He told her there was something she needed to know before they reached the sanctuary. Something about why her bloodline mattered beyond just ancient power and divine favor. He told her about a prophecy. Not one of the vague, poetic predictions that could mean anything depending on interpretation. A specific one, carved into the walls of Mufel Sanctuary 300 years ago by the last oracle before the bloodline died out. The prophecy spoke of a time when the Pax would be in chaos, divided and weakening, easy prey for forces that had been held at bay for generations. It spoke of darkness rising from the spaces between territories, of old enemies returning, of a threat that would require the Pax to unite or face extinction. And it spoke of the one who would bring them together. A Mu-born daughter born in hiding, marked by rejection, who would rise with silver flame in her hands and ancient power in her voice. Who would stand between the Pax and annihilation? Who would either save them all or watch them burn depending on choices that hadn't yet been made? Liora felt her blood turn cold. She told him he couldn't be serious. That prophecies were stories, legends, things people made up to explain events after they'd already happened. That she couldn't be what he was describing. But even as she protested, the silver light in her veins pulsed stronger. And somewhere deep inside, where that ancient power lived, she felt recognition. Like the power knew what it was meant for even if she didn't. Damien told her he'd spent 15 years trying to prevent that prophecy from coming true the hard way. Trying to unite the Pax through diplomacy, through reminding them of old alliances, through being everything an Alpha King was supposed to be. But the modern Pax didn't want unity. They wanted their territories and their power and their petty conflicts. He'd failed. And now the darkness the prophecy warned about was beginning to stir. He'd felt it moving in the spaces between territories, testing boundaries, looking for weakness. Which meant he needed her. The Pax needed her. Whether she was ready or not. Whether she wanted this destiny or not. The weight of his words settled over her like a physical force. Liora looked up at the stars beginning to appear through the forest canopy, feeling smaller and more lost than she'd ever felt in her life. She'd gone from being nothing and Omega no one wanted, to being everything. The supposed answer to an ancient prophecy. The potential savior of all shifter kind. She didn't know which fate was crueler. If Liora's journey is pulling you deeper into this world of ancient magic and destiny, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Because the story you're living in right now, we're only just beginning to uncover its secrets. The attack came at dawn. Liora had been awake for hours, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She'd spent the night staring at the fire, watching the flames dance while her mind replayed everything Damien had told her about prophecies and ancient threats and her supposed role in preventing catastrophe. The weight of it pressed down on her chest until breathing felt like work. Damien had finally dozed off sometime before dawn, though even in sleep he remained alert, his body positioned between her and the forest beyond their small camp. She'd watched him for a while, this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere claiming to be her salvation, and wondered what he wasn't telling her. What parts of the story he'd carefully omitted. Because in her experience, people always held something back. Always had their own agenda beneath whatever noble purpose they claimed. The first sign of danger was the birds. They stopped singing. All at once, like someone had cut the sound with a knife. The forest fell into a silence so complete it made her ears ring. Damien's eyes snapped open instantly. No grogginess, no moment of confusion. He was on his feet before Liora could even register what had changed, his body tense, his gaze scanning the tree line with predatory focus. He told her to get behind him. His voice was low, urgent, carrying a command that made her body obey before her mind could question. She scrambled up from where she'd been sitting and moved to where he indicated, her heart already hammering against her ribs. The silver light in her veins responded to her fear, beginning to pulse brighter beneath her skin. She could feel the power stirring, waking fully, preparing for whatever was coming. They emerged from the forest like ghosts materializing from shadow. 7 of them. Not from Silver Paw, these wore different colors, different symbols on their ceremonial leather. But the hostility in their eyes was universal. The kind of hatred that came from deep-seated belief rather than personal grievance. The leader stepped forward. Older than the others, with gray threading through his dark hair and scars crossing his face that spoke of decades of combat. He wore the mark of a beta, second in command, and his authority radiated through the clearing like heat. He addressed Damien with barely concealed contempt. Called him by title, Alpha King, but made the words sound like an insult. Asked what he thought he was doing in Thornridge territory. Asked why he'd brought that thing with him. That thing. He meant Liora. His gaze flicked to her, and she saw disgust there. Fear, too, badly hidden beneath the aggression. He could sense what she was. Could feel the power radiating from her even though she hadn't consciously called it forth. Damien's voice when he responded was cold enough to freeze blood. He told the beta they were passing through that they had no interest in Thornridge politics or territory. That they would be gone by midday and the pack would never know they'd been here. The beta laughed. It was an ugly sound, full of malice and certainty. He said that wouldn't be happening. That his alpha had received word about what happened at the Silver Paw ceremony. About the Omega who'd manifested forbidden power and fled with the so-called Alpha King. That every pack within 5 territories had been warned to watch for them. That Thornridge pack would not harbor abominations or those who protected them. Liora felt the word like a physical blow. Abomination. It was worse than cursed. Worse than unworthy. It meant she was something that shouldn't exist. Something that needed to be eliminated for the good of all shifter kind. Damien moved slightly, repositioning himself so he blocked her completely from the beta's view. His voice dropped lower, taking on a quality that made the air itself feel heavier. He told the beta to choose his next words carefully. That attacking an Alpha King was an act of war that would bring consequences Thornridge couldn't afford. But the beta just smiled. He said the old titles didn't mean what they used to. That Alpha Kings were legends from a dead age and Damien was just one wolf against 7. That no one would question Thornridge's actions when they explained they'd eliminated a dangerous rogue and her delusional protector. He gave a signal. The 6 wolves behind him began to shift. Not to full wolf form, but to that dangerous in-between state, half-human, half-beast, built for maximum violence. Their bones cracked and reformed. Their faces elongated. Claws erupted from their fingertips. Their eyes blazed with predatory hunger. Liora's breath caught in her throat. She tried to call her own wolf, tried to shift, but the animal inside her was still too traumatized, still hiding too deep. The silver power pulsed stronger, but she didn't know how to use it, didn't know how to turn it into anything useful. She was defenseless except for whatever protection Damien could offer. And he was 1 against 7. The beta shifted last, his transformation more controlled than the others, speaking to decades of practice. When he spoke again, his voice came out distorted by his changed jaw structure, more growl than words. He told Damien to step aside. That they had no quarrel with him. That if he handed over the abomination, he could leave with his life. Damien's response was to shift. But not like the others. Not into that violent in-between state. He went straight to full wolf form, and the transformation was so fluid, so instantaneous, that it seemed less like a physical change and more like he'd simply revealed what had been there all along. His wolf was massive. Easily twice the size of any shifter Liora had ever seen. Black as midnight with those same dark eyes that somehow looked even more intelligent, even more ancient in animal form. And the power that radiated from him increased exponentially. It pressed down on everyone in the clearing like gravity had suddenly doubled. This was an alpha king in his true form. And even the Thornridge wolves hesitated, their earlier confidence wavering. But they'd come too far to back down now. The beta snarled an order and his pack attacked. What followed was violence Liora had never witnessed before. She'd seen pack dominance fights, the ritualized combat that settled disputes without causing permanent damage. This was nothing like that. This was 7 wolves trying to kill one, using every advantage of numbers and coordination they possessed. Damien met them like a storm. He was everywhere at once, moving with impossible speed and precision. He caught the first attacker mid-leap, his jaws closing around the wolf's throat and throwing him aside with force that sent the body crashing into a tree. He dodged another's claws by inches, countered with a strike that shattered ribs. 2 came at him simultaneously from different angles, and he somehow managed to engage both, his movements a blur of black fur and flashing teeth. But even he couldn't hold off 7 trained warriors indefinitely. They were landing hits, drawing blood, wearing him down through sheer persistence. A slash across his shoulder, teeth sinking into his back leg, claws raking his side. Liora watched in horror, feeling utterly useless. The silver light beneath her skin was blazing now, responding to her terror and desperation, but she didn't know what to do with it. She tried to remember how it had felt in the clearing with the standing stones, how the power had exploded outward and driven off the silver paw hunting party. But that had been instinctive, uncontrolled. She had no idea how to call it forth deliberately. One of the Thornridge wolves broke away from the main fight. A female, smaller than the others but no less vicious. She'd spotted Liora standing there defenseless and made the calculation that eliminating the actual target was smarter than helping overwhelm Damien. She charged. Liora stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The waymarker stone was directly behind her, blocking her escape. The female wolf's claws were extended, her jaws open, close enough now that Liora could see the hatred burning in her eyes. Time seemed to slow. Leora's back hit the waymarker stone, and the moment her skin made contact with the ancient rock, something inside her snapped. Not broke, snapped into place. Like a puzzle piece finally finding where it belonged. The silver light exploded outward. It wasn't like before. This time it was controlled. Focused. It shot from her hands in concentrated beams that caught the attacking wolf mid-leap and sent her flying backward. The female hit the ground hard, her fur smoking where the light had touched her, and didn't get up. Liora stared at her hands in shock. The silver light was still there, still glowing, but it didn't hurt. It felt natural. Like breathing. Like this was what her hands had always been meant to do. The remaining Thornridge wolves had noticed. Their attack on Damien faltered as they turned to look at her, at the power blazing from her palms, at the ancient waymarker stone glowing in response to her touch. Fear replaced aggression in their expressions. They'd known she had power, that's why they'd come. But knowing and witnessing were different things. The beta snarled something that might have been a command to regroup. But Damien didn't give them the chance. He used their distraction to go on the offensive, his massive wolf form tearing through their formation with renewed fury. He wasn't just defending anymore. He was eliminating threats. 2 more wolves went down in rapid succession. The remaining 4, including the beta, finally broke. Survival instinct overrode orders and pride and hatred. They ran, melting back into the forest, leaving their fallen pack members behind. Damien stood in the center of the clearing, his black fur matted with blood. Some his, most not, his sides heaving with exertion. He held his position for several heartbeats, making sure they were truly gone, before he shifted back to human form. The transformation revealed the extent of his injuries. Deep gashes across his shoulder and ribs. Bite marks on his leg that were bleeding freely. But he ignored them, moving toward Liora instead, his eyes scanning her for damage. She was physically unharmed, but shaking so violently she could barely stand. The silver light was fading from her hands, sinking back beneath her skin, leaving behind exhaustion that made her legs weak. She'd used power she didn't understand, had possibly killed someone. The female wolf hadn't moved since hitting the ground, and the reality of it was crashing down on her with devastating force. Damien reached her just as her legs gave out. He caught her, supporting her weight, his hands gentle despite the violence they'd just committed. He told her she was safe, that it was over, that she'd done what she needed to do. But Liora shook her head. Her voice came out broken when she spoke. She told him it wasn't over, that the beta had said other packs knew about her, that they'd been warned, that Thornridge had attacked them because someone had spread the word that she was dangerous, that she needed to be eliminated. That running to Mufel Sanctuary wouldn't save her because the entire shifter world now knew she existed and wanted her dead. Damien's expression grew grim. He told her she was right, that the attack had confirmed his worst fears, that someone, probably Ronan, possibly others, was actively turning the packs against her, painting her as a threat that needed to be destroyed before she came into her full power. He told her they couldn't stop now, that reaching Mufel was more critical than ever because it was the only place she'd be truly protected. The sanctuary existed outside pack law, on neutral ground so ancient and sacred that attacking it would violate every custom their kind still held dear. But first he needed to tend his wounds, and they needed to deal with the aftermath of the fight. Liora forced herself to look at the fallen Thornridge wolves. 3 of them. 2 were breathing, unconscious, but alive. The female she'd hit with the silver light wasn't moving at all. Liora made herself walk over, made herself look at what she'd done. The wolf's chest was still. No breath. No heartbeat. Dead. She'd killed someone. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow. She'd taken a life. This wolf, this woman, had family somewhere, pack bonds, a place in her community. And Liora had ended it with power she barely understood and couldn't control. She fell to her knees beside the body, her hands shaking. She wanted to feel remorse. Wanted to feel the weight of what she'd done. But underneath the shock, underneath the horror, there was something else. Relief. Satisfaction even. This wolf had been trying to kill her. Had looked at her with hatred and disgust, and had decided Leora's existence was an affront that needed to be erased. And Liora had refused to die. She'd fought back. She'd used the power everyone claimed made her dangerous, and she'd survived. The realization made her stomach twist. What kind of person felt relieved about killing someone? What kind of monster was she becoming? Damien's hand settled on her shoulder. His voice was quiet when he spoke, telling her that taking a life in self-defense didn't make her a monster. That the wolf had made a choice to attack, had known the risks, had died because she'd underestimated an opponent. That guilt was natural, but drowning in it served no purpose. He told her they needed to move. That the beta would return with reinforcements. That they were half a day from Mufel, and if they pushed hard they could reach it before nightfall. But Liora couldn't move. Couldn't stop staring at the dead wolf whose life she'd ended. Couldn't reconcile the girl she'd been yesterday, powerless, dismissed, beneath notice, with whatever she was now. Something powerful enough to kill with a thought. Something dangerous enough that entire packs wanted her eliminated. Something that maybe deserved the fear she saw in everyone's eyes. Damien crouched beside her. He took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him instead of the body. His dark eyes were intense, burning with certainty that cut through her spiraling thoughts. He told her she had a choice. She could let this break her. Could let the guilt and fear consume her until she became exactly what they accused her of being, dangerous, unstable, unworthy. Or she could accept that power came with consequences. That defending herself was not the same as being a threat. That she had every right to exist even if her existence made others uncomfortable. He told her she could be more than what they tried to make her. Could be what the prophecy described, someone who stood between the packs and destruction, not as their enemy, but as their reluctant savior. But only if she chose to stand up. His words resonated in her chest. Liora looked at his hands holding her face, at the blood still dripping from his wounds, at the certainty in his expression. He believed in her. This stranger who barely knew her. He looked at her and saw something worth protecting, worth saving, worth believing could be important. Maybe it was time she tried to see that too. She took a shaking breath and nodded. Forced herself to stand even though her legs still trembled. Forced herself to turn away from the body and face forward instead. Toward Mufel. Toward whatever waited there. Toward a future that terrified her but felt somehow inevitable. Damien stood with her. He used strips of fabric torn from his pack to bind his worst wounds, moving with efficiency that spoke to years of treating battlefield injuries. When he finished, he shouldered his pack and held out his hand to her. Just like he had in the clearing of Standing Stones. An offer. Not a command. She took it. And this time when their skin connected, she didn't pull away from the jolt of recognition and power that passed between them. She let it flow, let herself feel the strange connection that had formed between them in less than 2 days. A connection she didn't understand but couldn't deny. They left the clearing behind. Left the dead wolf and the unconscious ones and the blood-soaked ground. Moved deeper into the threshold lands with the knowledge that enemies were gathering, that word was spreading, that whatever sanctuary Mufel offered would be temporary at best. But they moved forward anyway, because stopping meant dying. And Liora had discovered something in that moment when silver light had exploded from her hands and saved her life. She didn't want to die. Didn't want to be erased or eliminated or made to disappear just because her existence inconvenienced those in power. She wanted to live. Wanted to understand this power burning through her veins. Wanted to look her enemies in the eye and make them understand that she wasn't going to make herself small anymore. The girl who'd stood in that ceremonial clearing and let herself be rejected and humiliated was gone. She'd died somewhere in the run through the storm, been reborn in silver light and ancient magic. What remained was someone new. Someone dangerous. Someone who'd just killed in self-defense and would do it again if necessary. Someone who was done being afraid. The forest grew denser as they traveled. The magic in the air intensified until Liora could taste it on her tongue, feel it pressing against her skin like a living thing. Her power responded to it, growing stronger with each step, the silver light beneath her skin pulsing in rhythm with some ancient heartbeat she could feel but not hear. Damien led her through paths that seemed to appear only when they needed them, past more waymarker stones that glowed brighter as they approached, through streams that ran with water so clear it looked like liquid crystal. Everything here felt sacred, untouched by the modern world. Preserved exactly as it had been centuries ago when the first wolves walked these lands. They didn't speak. The weight of what had happened in the clearing hung between them, too heavy for words. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt necessary. Like they both needed space to process what this meant, where they were going, what would happen when they finally reached their destination. As the sun climbed toward its peak, they crested a ridge and Liora saw it. Mufel Sanctuary. It spread out in the valley below like something from a dream. Ancient ruins rose from the forest floor, stone structures so old they'd half melted back into the earth, covered in moss and flowering vines. At the center stood what must have been a temple once, its walls still partially intact, open to the sky. And surrounding everything, standing in perfect circles like silent sentinels, were standing stones. Hundreds of them. Each one carved with symbols that blazed with silver light even in broad daylight. The power radiating from that place made what she'd felt at the smaller waymarker seem like candlelight compared to a bonfire. It called to her, drew her. Made the silver light in her veins surge so strongly she had to stop walking, had to catch her breath against the intensity of it. Damien watched her reaction with something that looked like satisfaction mixed with concern. He told her this was it. The place where everything would change. Where she would learn what she really was. Where she would have to choose what she wanted to become. Liora stared down at the sanctuary, at the ancient stones and ruined temple and power so thick she could see it shimmering in the air like heat waves. Fear and anticipation twisted together in her gut. This was the threshold. The point of no return. Once she stepped into that valley, into that concentration of ancient magic, there would be no going back to who she'd been. But who she'd been was gone anyway. Destroyed in a ceremonial clearing by an alpha who'd feared her potential. Reborn in silver light and prophecy and violence she'd never imagined herself capable of. Maybe it was time to find out who she could be instead. She looked at Damien. At this man who'd appeared from nowhere and turned her entire world inside out. Who'd offered protection when she had nothing. Who'd killed to defend her even though they barely knew each other. Who looked at her like she was the answer to questions he'd been asking for years. She asked him one more time if he was certain. If he truly believed she was what the prophecy described. If he really thought she could be whatever it was the sanctuary would reveal. Damien's expression softened. He told her he'd never been more certain of anything in his life. That the moment he'd felt her power ignite across 3 territories, he'd known. That watching her face down 7 trained warriors with nothing but newly awakened gifts and sheer stubborn refusal to die had only confirmed it. That she was exactly what the shifter world needed, even if they were too blind and too frightened to see it yet. His faith in her was almost painful. She didn't know how to carry it, how to live up to it. But she would try. Because what other choice did she have? They began their descent into the valley. Into Mufel Sanctuary. Into whatever destiny waited there with silver flames and ancient prophecies and the terrible burden of being exactly what everyone feared she would become. Behind them, the forest whispered with movement. Pack wolves gathering at the border of the threshold lands, too afraid or too wise to follow further. Watching. Waiting. Reporting back to their alphas that the abomination and her protector had reached the sanctuary. That the prophecy was unfolding exactly as it had been written 300 years ago. And that the packs would have to decide very soon whether they would stand with her or against her. Because the darkness the prophecy warned about was coming. And when it arrived, their decision would determine whether the shifter world survived or burned to ash. The interior of the sanctuary stole Liora's breath. What had looked like ruins from the ridge above revealed itself to be something far more complex once they descended into the valley. The temple at the center was indeed partially destroyed, its roof long gone and its walls crumbling in places. But the damage felt intentional somehow, like the structure had been opened to the sky on purpose rather than through neglect or disaster. Silver moonlight would pour straight through when darkness fell, illuminating whatever sacred space lay at its heart. The standing stones formed 3 concentric circles around the temple, each one taller than the last, each carved with symbols that grew progressively more intricate toward the center. They hummed with power. Not sound exactly, but vibration that Liora felt in her bones, in her teeth, in the marrow of her being. The silver light beneath her skin responded immediately, blazing brighter than it had since the attack, reaching toward the stones like it recognized home. Damien led her through the outer circle, then the middle one, walking with reverence that felt foreign on someone so controlled and dangerous. He touched each stone as they passed, his fingers tracing symbols with the kind of familiarity that spoke of many previous visits. When they reached the innermost circle, he paused. He told her this was as far as he could accompany her for now. That the temple itself was sacred ground meant only for those who carried Mu-born blood. That if he crossed the threshold uninvited, the wards would reject him violently no matter who he was or what title he carried. That she would have to walk the last steps alone. Liora's pulse quickened. The temple entrance loomed before her, a stone archway carved with more of those shifting symbols, flanked by 2 massive standing stones that blazed brighter than all the others. Beyond it, she could see a chamber bathed in silver light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She asked Damien what she was supposed to do once she went inside. What the sanctuary would demand of her. He told her he didn't know exactly. That the sanctuary revealed different truths to different Mu-born bloodlines. That whatever happened, she needed to face it without fear. Without trying to suppress or control the power that would rise to meet the ancient magic saturated in that place. That resistance would only make it more painful. That she needed to let go and trust the sanctuary to show her what she needed to see. Trust. That word again. Liora looked at Damien. At the man who'd killed for her, who'd guided her here, who stood watching her with an expression that managed to be both encouraging and concerned. She'd trusted him this far. had let him lead her away from everything she'd known into the wilderness and toward a destiny she'd never asked for. She supposed she could trust him a little further. She nodded, took a breath, stepped toward the archway. The moment she crossed beneath it, the world changed. Not physically. The temple remained the temple, stone and moss and ancient carvings. But the quality of reality shifted. Time felt different here, slower and faster simultaneously, like she was experiencing multiple moments at once. The silver light that had been pulsing beneath her skin exploded outward, no longer contained by her body, but flowing around her in visible streams that looked like liquid moonlight given form. And the voices began. Not the whispers from the clearing. These were clearer, stronger, speaking in that ancient language her conscious mind couldn't understand, but her blood recognized. They came from the stones, from the earth beneath her feet, from the very air itself. They spoke of lineage and legacy and power that had been sleeping for generations, waiting for the right vessel to wake. They spoke her mother's name, Liora, and other names before that. Grandmothers and great-grandmothers stretching back through centuries, each one a Mu-born daughter who'd carried the gift and passed it forward through their bloodline. They spoke of the last oracle, the woman who'd carved the prophecy into these walls 300 years ago before the gift died with her, before the knowledge was lost and the Mu-born lines were hunted nearly to extinction. They spoke of how she'd seen this moment, had seen Liora specifically, had known that one day a daughter would be born who could reclaim what had been stolen. The voices grew louder, overlapping, becoming a chorus that filled her head until she couldn't hear her own thoughts. She fell to her knees in the center of the chamber, her hands pressed against cold stone, her body shaking with the force of power that demanded to be acknowledged. And then the visions came. She saw her mother as a young woman, barely older than Liora was now, running through a forest at night with a child clutched to her chest. Running from wolves who wore different colors but carried the same hatred. Running from an alpha who discovered what she was and had ordered her execution before she could become a threat. She saw Liora reaching the Silverpaw border, begging for asylum, desperate enough to submit to the lowest rank if it meant her daughter would survive. Saw her spending years performing suppression rituals on Liora while she slept, binding her daughter's power layer by layer until it was buried so deep no one would ever know what she carried. She saw her mother's fear, her constant vigilance, her knowledge that discovery meant death for both of them. And she saw the moment Liora had felt her own end approaching, had known the illness consuming her was something she couldn't fight, had used her final hours to reinforce those bindings one last time while whispering prayers that her daughter would stay hidden long enough to grow strong. That her daughter would forgive her for the cage she'd built around her gifts. The vision shifted. Liora saw herself now, but through other eyes. Through Damien's eyes. She saw herself as he'd first sensed her, a flicker of barely contained power trying desperately to remain invisible. She saw him watching from a distance for years, frustrated by how thoroughly Liora's suppression worked, waiting for any sign that the bloodline still lived beneath the magical locks. She saw the moment her power had ignited in the clearing. Saw how it had blazed across territories like a beacon visible to anyone with the sensitivity to feel it. Saw Damien's immediate recognition and his desperate race to reach her before others did. Saw the calculation in his expression, not just relief that a Mu-born had finally awakened, but something more complex. Hope mixed with fear. Need mixed with uncertainty. The vision shifted again. This time she saw darkness. Literal darkness, not just absence of light, but something alive and malevolent. It moved through the spaces between territories like smoke, touching the borders of packlands, testing defenses, searching for weaknesses. Where it touched, corruption followed. Wolves turned on each other. Alphas grew paranoid and violent. Ancient alliances crumbled. She saw it reaching towards Silverpaw territory. Saw Alpha Ronins standing at the border, staring into that darkness with fear in his eyes. Saw him realize that something was coming that his pack couldn't fight. Saw the moment he'd made the decision about Liora, not because he'd truly believed she was cursed, but because he'd sensed her suppressed power and had recognized what it might become if she awakened at the wrong moment. He'd rejected her to protect his pack from being associated with forbidden power right before the world collapsed into chaos. Cowardice disguised as pragmatism. The darkness in her vision grew larger, spreading, consuming. And then she saw what it was moving toward. Saw the true scope of the threat the prophecy had warned about. An army. Not of wolves, but of something older. Something that had existed before shifters had even learned to take human form. Creatures that fed on pack bonds and territory magic, that grew stronger with every alliance that shattered, every war that broke out between wolf packs too fractured to stand united. They'd been waiting at the edges of the world for centuries, held back by the combined strength of united shifters and the ancient magic that flowed through their bloodlines. But that unity was breaking. That magic was fading with every Mooborn line that went extinct. The barriers were failing. And when they fell completely, the creatures would pour through and devour everything. Unless someone stood between them and the shifter world. Unless someone with enough power could hold the line long enough for the packs to remember how to stand together instead of tearing each other apart. Unless the prophecy was fulfilled. The vision released her with force that sent her sprawling backward. She gasped for air, her chest heaving, her entire body trembling. The silver light that had been flowing around her withdrew, sinking back beneath her skin, leaving behind a warmth that felt like acceptance. Like the sanctuary had examined her and found her worthy of the knowledge it guarded. Footsteps echoed through the chamber. Damien appeared in the archway, his expression tight with concern. He must have felt something through the wards, must have sensed her distress even though he couldn't enter while the ritual was active. He asked if she was all right. Liora laughed. It came out bitter and broken. She told him she'd just seen the end of the world. Seen the true scope of what the prophecy actually meant. That she wasn't just supposed to unite the packs through diplomacy or political maneuvering. She was supposed to be a living barrier between them and annihilation. A weapon made of moonlight and ancient power, pointed at enemies that would devour them all. That she was meant to burn herself out holding back darkness, while the packs she was protecting actively tried to kill her. The words hung in the air between them. Damien stepped across the threshold. Apparently the wards had deactivated now that the vision had ended and moved toward her. His movements were careful, like he was approaching something wild and dangerous that might bolt or attack. He crouched in front of her. Told her he'd seen fragments of that vision too. That he'd spent years studying the prophecy, trying to understand what was coming and how to prevent it. That he'd known the weight of what he was asking her to become, but had hoped. Foolishly perhaps, that she wouldn't have to see the full horror of it until she was stronger. That he was sorry she'd learned the truth so soon. Liora looked at him through tear-blurred eyes. Asked him why he cared. Why an Alpha King would spend 15 years searching for someone to throw into that kind of battle. Why he would guide her here and protect her and look at her with those eyes that suggested she meant something beyond her tactical value as a prophesied weapon. What she really was to him. Damien was quiet for a long moment. His expression shifted through emotions too quick to name before settling into something raw and honest. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. He told her his pack had been one of the first touched by that spreading darkness. 20 years ago, when he'd been nothing but a young alpha trying to hold together a territory on the verge of collapse. He'd watched his people turn on each other, watched madness spread through the pack bonds until wolves he'd grown up with were killing their own family members. He'd watched his mate, the woman he'd bonded with, the person who'd been the other half of his soul, succumb to the corruption. Watched her eyes turn black with that living darkness. Watched her attack their own pack members before he'd been forced to end her himself to save the others. The grief and guilt had nearly destroyed him. But afterward, when he'd tried to understand what had happened, he'd discovered references to the ancient prophecy. Had learned about Mooborn bloodlines and the power they'd once wielded to protect against exactly this kind of threat. Had realized that the darkness wasn't new, it had been trying to break through for centuries, held back by those who carried gifts that no longer existed in the modern world. He dedicated everything to finding a surviving Mooborn. Not as a weapon. As hope. as proof that maybe the old magic could be reclaimed, that maybe the barriers could be restored, that maybe he could prevent other packs from suffering what his had endured. That maybe he could give meaning to the death of someone he'd loved by saving others from the same fate. The confession settled between them like a physical weight. Liora saw him differently now. Not as a mysterious alpha king with hidden agendas, but as someone carrying grief so profound it had reshaped his entire existence. Someone who'd been alone in his knowledge and his mission for 2 decades, watching the darkness spread while trying desperately to find a solution before it was too late. Someone who looked at her and saw not just a prophesied savior, but the possibility of redemption for failures that still haunted him. She reached out without thinking and touched his face. Her fingers traced the scar through his eyebrow, the lines carved by years of burden, the exhaustion that lived permanently in his features. The silver light responded to the contact, flowing from her fingertips into his skin, and she felt his pain like it was her own. The magnitude of his loss, the weight of his guilt, the desperate hope he'd been carrying for so long that it had become part of his identity. Damien closed his eyes at her touch. His hand came up to cover hers, holding it against his face like it was precious. Like she was precious. When he opened his eyes again, the vulnerability in them nearly broke her. He told her he understood if she wanted to run. That knowing the full scope of what the prophecy demanded was enough to make anyone flee. That he wouldn't blame her for choosing herself over a destiny that would consume her. That she'd already suffered enough rejection and pain without adding the burden of saving people who wanted her dead. That if she decided to leave, he would help her disappear. Would use his resources to get her somewhere safe and hidden where the darkness couldn't find her. Would go back to fighting alone like he'd been doing for 20 years. That her survival mattered more to him than the prophecy. The words shattered something inside Liora. No one had ever prioritized her survival before. Not her pack. Not even her mother, who'd loved her but had still kept her caged in suppression bindings. Everyone had either dismissed her existence or feared it or tried to use it for their own purposes. But Damien looked at her and saw a person first. Someone whose choices mattered. Someone who deserved agency over her own fate even if that fate was supposed to save the world. She told him she wasn't going to run. Not because she was brave. Not because she believed she could actually be what the prophecy described. But because she'd seen that darkness in her vision. Had felt its hunger. Had understood that if someone didn't stand against it, the creatures would consume everything. The packs that had rejected her. The wolves who wanted her dead. The territories and traditions and bonds that defined their entire species. All of it would be devoured. And she couldn't live with herself knowing she'd had the power to at least try and had chosen not to because she was afraid. Besides, she told him with a bitter smile, what kind of life would she have running and hiding forever? At least this way her existence meant something. At least this way the suffering she'd endured had purpose. Damien's expression shifted into something that looked like pain and pride tangled together. He told her she was stronger than she knew. Braver than most warriors twice her age. That choosing to stand when every rational thought screamed to flee was the mark of true courage. That he was honored to stand beside her. The sincerity in his voice undid her completely. Liora felt tears spill over, hot against her cheeks, releasing emotions she'd been holding back since the moment she'd crossed into this temple. Fear and grief and rage at the unfairness of everything that had happened. At being born with power that made her a target. At losing her mother too young. At spending years being dismissed only to discover she was supposed to save the very people who'd rejected her. Damien pulled her against his chest without hesitation. One hand cradled the back of her head while the other wrapped around her shoulders, holding her together while she fell apart. He didn't tell her to stop crying. Didn't try to minimize her pain or rush her through processing it. Just held her with steady strength and let her break down in a way she'd never been able to before. Because breaking down required safety. Required trust. Required believing someone would still be there when you pulled yourself back together. And for the first time in her life, Liora had that. They stayed like that until her tears ran dry and exhaustion pulled at her like a physical weight. The temple chamber around them had grown darker. Evening settling in, stars beginning to appear through the open roof above. The standing stones outside glowed brighter as moonlight replaced sunlight, their power singing through the sanctuary in ways that made her newly awakened gifts resonate in response. Damien finally pulled back enough to look at her. His hands framed her face, thumbs wiping away the last traces of tears. He told her they should rest. That tomorrow they would begin her training in earnest. That she needed to learn how to control the power before it controlled her. That the sanctuary would help, but she had to be strong enough to survive the process. That tonight, she should simply let herself exist without worrying about prophecies or destinies or threats gathering at the borders. He led her from the temple chamber to a smaller structure nearby, one of the few buildings that still had a mostly intact roof. Inside, someone had created a living space long ago. Sleeping furs that looked surprisingly well preserved. A fire pit with wood already laid. Supplies stored in sealed containers. Evidence that Damien had been preparing this place for years, waiting for the day he'd bring a moonborn here. He built a fire while she settled on the furs, her body finally giving in to the accumulated exhaustion of the past 2 days. Every muscle ached. Her mind felt scraped raw. But underneath it all, she felt something new. Not peace exactly, but purpose. Direction. Understanding of where she stood and what came next. Damien prepared food, simple trail rations, but more substantial than what they'd been eating. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them, the sound of the sanctuary's power humming in the background like distant music. When they'd finished, Damien moved to the opposite side of the space, giving her distance. Privacy. Respecting boundaries even though they'd spent the past 2 nights in close proximity. But Liora found she didn't want the distance. Didn't want to be alone with her thoughts and fears tonight. She told him to stay closer. That she felt safer when he was near. That after everything, the idea of sleeping alone felt wrong. Damien's expression softened. He moved back toward the fire, settling close enough that she could reach him if she needed, but not so close that he invaded her space. He told her he would keep watch. That she should sleep. That nothing would hurt her here. Liora lay down on the furs, the firelight dancing across the stone walls, and watched him for a while. This man who'd lost everything and had still chosen to keep fighting. Who'd spent decades searching for hope in the form of a bloodline most believed extinct. Who looked at her not as a weapon or a prophecy, but as someone worth protecting for her own sake. She asked him what his mate had been like. The question hung in the air. She half expected him to shut down, to tell her that was too personal, too painful to discuss. But after a moment, he began to speak. Told her about Senna. A healer with a gentle spirit and fierce determination. Someone who'd believed the pack bonds could be strengthened through compassion rather than dominance. Who'd challenged him constantly to be better than his instincts pushed him to be. Someone he'd loved with the kind of intensity that came from finding your other half in a world that made such connections rare and precious. He told her how the corruption had started small. Mood changes he'd attributed to stress. Moments of irritability that seemed understandable given their circumstances. How he hadn't realized what was happening until it was too late to save her. How he still wondered if he'd been faster, smarter, more observant, whether he could have stopped it. How he still dreamed about her sometimes. About the moment he'd been forced to end her life to save the others. About the way she'd looked at him in that final second, not with the black-eyed madness of corruption, but with a flicker of her true self breaking through. With gratitude that he'd had the strength to do what she could no longer do for herself. His voice broke on the last words. Liora watched this powerful man crack open and show her the wound that had never healed, would never heal, just learn to be carried. She understood then why he'd dedicated everything to finding a solution. Why he'd looked at her with such desperate hope. He wasn't trying to save the world abstractly. He was trying to save the person Senna had been before the darkness took her. Trying to make her death mean something. Trying to prove that love and loss could be transmuted into purpose that mattered. Liora sat up and moved closer to him. She took his hand, the same way he'd offered his to her multiple times over the past days. Connection. Solidarity. The simple human need to not face pain alone. She told him she was sorry, that she couldn't imagine surviving that kind of loss, that she understood now why this mattered so much to him beyond abstract duty, that she would do everything in her power to prevent other wolves from suffering what Senna had endured. Damien looked at their joined hands. When he raised his eyes to hers, something had shifted in his expression. The walls he'd maintained, the emotional distance that came from years of isolation and grief, had cracked. What showed through was raw and honest and terrifying in its intensity. He told her she was dangerous. Not because of her power. Because of how she made him feel. Like maybe he didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. Like maybe there was room in his existence for something beyond revenge and redemption and the endless grinding work of trying to hold back inevitable darkness. Like maybe he could want something for himself again. The confession hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to fully examine. Liora felt her pulse quicken. Felt the air between them change quality, become charged with possibility that had nothing to do with prophecies or ancient magic. She'd never been close to someone like this. Never had space in her life for attraction or desire when she'd been focused on simply surviving each day. But Damien had torn down every wall she'd built. Had seen her at her absolute worst and had chosen to stay anyway. Had offered protection and understanding and faith when she'd had nothing. And now he sat close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. Close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Close enough that when she leaned forward slightly, testing, he didn't pull away. Their faces were inches apart. His gaze dropped to her lips then back to her eyes, asking permission without words. She should be afraid. Should remember that men had hurt her, that trust was dangerous, that she barely knew him despite everything they'd shared. But fear felt distant compared to the pull between them. The recognition that had existed since the moment they'd met. The sense that somehow, despite all logic, they'd been moving toward this moment since long before they'd actually encountered each other. Damien whispered her name. A question and a statement, giving her every opportunity to retreat. Instead, she closed the distance. The kiss was gentle at first. Tentative. Like they were both afraid of breaking something precious. His lips were soft against hers, tasting of smoke and forest and something indefinable that was purely him. The silver light beneath her skin responded immediately, warming, reaching toward him like it had found something it recognized. Then the kiss deepened. Became something more urgent. Years of loneliness and pain and desperate need poured into it from both sides. His hand moved to the back of her neck, fingers threading through her hair, while her hands gripped his shoulders like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, neither spoke. Words felt insufficient for what had just passed between them. Connection that transcended logic or timing or the thousand reasons this was complicated and potentially destructive. They simply held each other as the fire burned low and the sanctuary's power hummed around them. Two broken people who'd found each other at the end of everything. Who'd chosen to stand together when the world demanded they face annihilation alone. And as Liora finally drifted toward sleep, wrapped in Damien's arms, listening to his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, she thought maybe the prophecy had gotten one thing wrong. She wouldn't be standing alone between darkness and the packs. She'd have him beside her. And somehow, that made the impossible feel almost survivable. The messenger arrived at dawn on the third day. Liora awoke to the sound of wings. Not bird wings, but something larger, heavier, cutting through the air with mechanical precision. She pushed herself up from the furs where she'd been sleeping pressed against Damien's warmth, her body instantly alert despite the exhaustion that still clung to her bones. The past 2 days had been consumed by training, by learning to channel the silver light without letting it consume her, by pushing her limits until her gifts responded to intention rather than pure emotion. But the sound that had woken her was wrong. Foreign. It didn't belong in the sanctuary's ancient peace. Damien was already moving, on his feet and positioned between her and the entrance before she'd fully processed the danger. His body was tense, coiled, every muscle ready for violence. But he didn't shift. Didn't attack. just watched the entrance with an expression that managed to be both wary and resigned, like he'd been expecting this moment and had hoped it wouldn't come so soon. The creature that landed at the sanctuary's outer boundary was something Liora had only seen in the old texts. A messenger hawk, not a natural bird, but a construct of magic and flesh, bred centuries ago to carry communications between packs when distance or danger made normal travel impossible. Its eyes glowed with amber light that had nothing to do with natural biology. Around its leg was bound a scroll sealed with wax that bore multiple pack symbols pressed into the surface. A summons. From the Council of Alphas. Damien retrieved it without crossing the boundary stones that protected the sanctuary's heart. The hawk launched itself skyward the moment the scroll was removed, disappearing into the morning light like it had never existed. Damien stood there for a long moment, staring at the sealed document in his hands, and Liora watched his expression shift from resignation to something darker. Something that looked like fury barely contained. He told her they had 3 days to present themselves before the council. That word of her awakening had spread faster than he'd anticipated. That the Alphas were demanding answers about the Moonborn who'd manifested forbidden power and the Alpha King who'd spirited her away to an ancient sanctuary instead of delivering her to proper authority. That they wanted to determine whether she was a threat that needed to be neutralized. Liora felt cold settle into her chest despite the morning warmth. The Council of Alphas was the closest thing their fractured world had to centralized government. Representatives from the 12 most powerful packs gathered to make decisions that affected all shifter kind. In theory, they existed to maintain peace and uphold tradition. In practice, they were politicians more concerned with preserving their own power than protecting their people. And now they wanted to judge her. Damien broke the seal and read the contents, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he handed it to her without comment. The formal language couldn't quite hide the hostility beneath. They spoke of ancient laws regarding forbidden bloodlines, of protocols for handling wolves who manifested dangerous abilities, of the necessity of ensuring the safety of all packs over the desires of individual rogues. They spoke about her like she was a disease that might spread if not properly contained. And then came the part that made her stomach drop. The council demanded Damien explain his actions in harboring her, questioned whether his judgment had been compromised, suggested that perhaps his grief over losing his mate years ago had made him desperate enough to see salvation where only threat existed. They were questioning his authority, his sanity, his right to the title he carried. Because of her. Liora handed the scroll back, her hands trembling. She told him he should go without her. That she could stay here in the sanctuary where the council's authority didn't reach. That there was no reason for him to risk everything he'd built, everything he was, by standing beside someone the entire shifter world wanted eliminated. That she wasn't worth what this would cost him. Damien's response was to take her face in his hands and tell her with absolute certainty that she was worth everything. That he'd known the council would react this way eventually. That standing before them was inevitable if they wanted any chance of uniting the packs before the darkness consumed them all. That they would face this together or not at all. The conviction in his voice almost convinced her. Almost made her believe they could walk into a room full of hostile alphas and emerge intact. But she learned not to trust in fairy tale endings. The world didn't reward courage with safety. It punished difference with violence dressed up as justice. They spent the next 2 days preparing. Damien coached her on council protocols, on the complex web of alliances and grudges that defined pack politics, on which alphas might be sympathetic and which would want her dead on principle. He taught her how to present herself, strong but not threatening, powerful but not uncontrolled, respectful of tradition while refusing to be diminished by it. It felt like learning to be someone else. Like putting on a mask and pretending the girl underneath didn't exist. The sanctuary seemed to sense their impending departure. The standing stones hummed louder, their power pressing against Liora's skin like a physical plea to stay. The temple chamber where she'd received her visions glowed brighter each night, as if trying to show her something she'd missed. But whatever message the ancient magic was trying to convey remained frustratingly unclear. On the morning of the third day, they prepared to leave. Liora, dressed in clothing Damien had produced from somewhere, simple but well-made, nothing like the torn ceremonial gown or borrowed jacket she'd been wearing. Dark leather pants and a tunic that allowed movement while covering the silver light that still pulsed visibly through her veins when her emotions ran high. She braided her hair back from her face, trying to look composed and in control despite the fear churning in her stomach. Damien watched her prepare with an expression she couldn't quite read. When she finished, he stepped close and placed something in her palm. She looked down to find a pendant, not her mother's lost one, but something new. A crescent moon carved from what looked like solidified moonlight, hanging on a silver chain that felt warm against her skin. He told her it was a ward, that it would help contain her power if she needed to appear less threatening. That it wouldn't suppress her gifts the way her mother's bindings had, just mute them enough that the council couldn't sense the full scope of what she carried. That it might keep her alive long enough to actually speak before they decided her fate. Liora fastened it around her neck, feeling the ward's magic settle against her sternum like a second heartbeat. The silver light that had been constantly visible beneath her skin dimmed to barely perceptible threads. She looked almost normal now. Almost human. Almost like she wasn't carrying power that could reshape the world. Almost like she wasn't exactly what they feared. They left the sanctuary as the sun reached its peak. Liora felt the wards release her reluctantly, like the ancient magic didn't want to let her go. She looked back once at the standing stones and ruined temple, at the place that had shown her what she really was, and wondered if she would ever return. The journey to council territory took a full day of hard travel. They moved through neutral lands, avoiding pack boundaries, staying to paths that felt abandoned and forgotten. But they weren't alone. Liora could sense eyes watching from the shadows. Could hear movement in the undergrowth that was too deliberate to be natural wildlife. Word of their coming had spread, and wolves gathered to observe the Moonborn and her protector making their way to judgment. Some watched with curiosity, others with open hostility, none with welcome. As evening fell, they reached the border of council lands, territory held by no single pack, but maintained by all of them collectively for gatherings exactly like this. Ancient meeting grounds where treaties had been signed and wars declared, where the fate of their kind had been decided for generations. Where Liora would now stand trial for the crime of existing. The council hall rose from the forest like something out of legend. Massive stone structure built in an age when shifters had openly claimed their power, when they'd built monuments to their strength rather than hiding in shadows. 12 pillars flanked the entrance, each one carved with the symbol of one of the great packs. Torches blazed in iron brackets, casting dancing shadows across carved wolves that seemed to move in the flickering light. And standing at the entrance, waiting for them with barely contained hostility, was Beta Garrick. Liora's breath caught. The Silverpaw Beta who'd escorted her across the boundary. Who'd led the hunting party that had chased her into that clearing of standing stones. Who'd looked at her with such contempt and satisfaction when she'd been rejected and banished. He stood in full ceremonial dress now, wearing the colors of his pack, the marks of his rank visible on his leather vest. His expression when he saw her was pure malice, barely concealed beneath diplomatic neutrality. He addressed Damien with false respect, informing him that the council was assembled and waiting. That they would be permitted to enter and present their case. That all 12 alphas had come personally, a rare occurrence that spoke to the seriousness of the charges being considered. His eyes flicked to Liora, and his lip curled just slightly before he controlled his expression. He told her that she would be expected to demonstrate her power if requested. That the council would determine whether her gifts were divine blessing or demonic curse. That tradition demanded full transparency when dealing with bloodlines that had been specifically outlawed for the protection of all shifter kind. The word outlawed hit like a physical blow. She'd known her gifts were feared, but hearing that her very existence violated laws most packs still upheld made the danger crystallize into something concrete and terrifying. Damien stepped slightly in front of her, his body language protective without being aggressive. He told Garrick they understood the protocols and were prepared to answer any legitimate questions the council had. The emphasis on legitimate made Garrick's eyes narrow, but he simply turned and led them inside without further comment. The interior of the council hall was designed to intimidate. High vaulted ceilings that made individual wolves feel small and insignificant. Torches that cast more shadow than light. And at the far end, arranged in a semicircle on raised platforms, sat 12 alphas in positions of judgment. Liora recognized only one, Alpha Ronin of Silver Pack, looking as golden and perfect as ever, his ice blue eyes tracking her entrance with an expression that sent chills down her spine. The others were strangers, but their hostility needed no introduction. She could feel it radiating from them in waves that made the ward around her neck pulse with protective magic. They were arranged by pack status, the most powerful at the center, lesser packs at the edges. At the central position sat an older female alpha that Liora didn't recognize, her silver hair braided with authority symbols, her eyes sharp with intelligence that spoke of decades navigating pack politics. This was Alpha Morrigan of the Shadowfang Pack, the council's current leader, whose reputation for brutal pragmatism was known even to Omegas who paid little attention to such things. Morrigan's voice cut through the hall's oppressive silence. She welcomed them with words that held no warmth, simply acknowledged their presence, and stated the council's purpose: to investigate reports of forbidden power manifesting, to determine whether the wolf in question posed a threat to pack stability and safety, to decide what measures, if any, were necessary to protect their kind from potential danger. She spoke about Liora like she wasn't standing right there. Like she was an object being evaluated rather than a person with agency and rights. Damien stepped forward, his voice carrying authority that made several of the alphas shift uncomfortably. He began presenting their case, explaining about the Moonborn bloodlines, about the prophecy, about the threat gathering at the borders that would require exactly the kind of power Liora possessed to combat. But before he could get far, Alpha Ronin interrupted. His voice was smooth, reasonable, carrying just enough concern to sound genuine to anyone who didn't know better. He told the council that he'd attempted to evaluate the Omega in question for potential integration into his pack. That during the ceremonial process, he'd sensed something deeply wrong in her, corruption that suggested her power wasn't divine blessing, but something darker. That she'd fled before he could properly contain and study the threat she posed. That Alpha King Damien had intervened and taken her away, preventing proper evaluation and potentially endangering everyone by training her to use gifts that should have been suppressed for the safety of all. The lies were so smoothly delivered that Liora almost doubted her own memories. Almost believed that Ronin's public rejection had been motivated by concern rather than cowardice and political calculation. Damien's response was cold fury barely contained. He called Ronin's account what it was, a fabrication designed to cover the Silverpaw Alpha's failure to recognize legitimate divine power when it manifested in his own territory. That Ronin had rejected and banished Liora not because she was corrupted, but because he'd feared her potential and had wanted her eliminated before she could become a threat to his authority. The accusation hung in the air. Several alphas shifted uncomfortably, calling another alpha a liar before the full council was a serious breach of protocol. But Damien didn't back down. He met Ronin's gaze with challenge that made the younger alpha's composure crack just slightly. Alpha Morrigan intervened before the confrontation could escalate. She announced that debate about motivations was pointless without evidence. That the council needed to assess the wolf in question directly. That Liora would demonstrate her power so they could determine its nature themselves. She gestured to the center of the hall where ceremonial circles had been carved into the stone floor. An evaluation space where wolves were tested, where dominance was established, where sentences were sometimes carried out when the council deemed it necessary. Liora felt Damien tense beside her. He told Morrigan that forcing an unpredictable demonstration in a hostile environment was dangerous. That Liora's gifts responded to threat, and surrounding her with wolves who'd already decided she was dangerous would only prove their fears correct through self-fulfilling prophecy. But Morrigan was unmoved. She stated that if Liora couldn't control her power, that itself was evidence she posed too great a risk. That the council would accept no excuses or delays. That she would demonstrate her gifts now or be assumed to be deliberately hiding the full extent of her corruption. There was no good choice. Refuse and be condemned. Demonstrate and risk losing control in front of 12 hostile alphas who would interpret any display as justification for elimination. Liora stepped forward before Damien could protest further. She moved to the center of the evaluation circle, feeling the weight of 24 eyes tracking her every movement. The ward around her neck pulsed faster, struggling to contain power that wanted to respond to the threat permeating the hall. Alpha Morrigan's voice cut through the tension. She instructed Liora to remove the ward. That they would assess her true nature, not some muted version designed to deceive. Liora's hands moved to the clasp at her neck. She could feel Damien's gaze on her, could sense his desperate need to intervene tempered by knowledge that doing so would only make things worse. The pendant came free, and immediately the silver light blazed to visibility beneath her skin. Bright enough to cast shadows. Bright enough to make several of the alphas lean back in their seats. Bright enough to make them afraid. Morrigan ordered her to summon her power. To show them what she could do. To prove that she had control rather than being controlled by forces she didn't understand. Liora closed her eyes and reached inward for the gifts that had awakened in crisis and chaos. The silver light responded immediately, eager, ready to defend her against the hostility pressing down from all sides. She tried to channel it the way Damien had taught her, focused, controlled, a demonstration of ability rather than raw destructive force. The light flowed from her hands in streams that looked like liquid moonlight. She shaped it into forms, animals, symbols, structures, showing that she could manipulate the power with precision. That it responded to her will rather than acting independently. But the council wasn't impressed. They were terrified. She could see it in their faces, hear it in the way their breathing had changed, feel it in the sudden surge of defensive aggression radiating from the semicircle of alphas. They looked at her display of controlled power and saw only threat. Saw someone who could potentially destroy them all if she chose. Saw their own obsolescence reflected in abilities they didn't possess and couldn't counter. Alpha Ronan stood, his voice carrying across the hall with carefully crafted concern. He pointed out that her power looked exactly like the corruption that had destroyed packs in the past. That the old texts warned of wolves who could channel moonlight in their final stages before the darkness consumed them completely. That what the council was witnessing wasn't divine blessing, but the early manifestation of something that would eventually turn her into exactly the kind of threat the prophecy actually warned about. That she would bring destruction, not salvation. The other alphas began murmuring agreement. The narrative was being shaped right in front of her. Ronan twisting truth into something that justified fear, that made eliminating her seem like the responsible choice rather than murder. Liora tried to speak, tried to defend herself, but her voice was drowned out by the rising debate among the council members. Some argued for immediate containment. Others suggested permanent suppression through the kind of binding rituals that had been outlawed decades ago for being too cruel. A very few, suggested waiting, studying, trying to determine the truth before making irreversible decisions. But the momentum was against her. She could feel it shifting, could sense the verdict forming before it was officially delivered. And then someone new spoke. A voice from the shadows at the back of the hall, where observers were permitted to witness council proceedings without participating. The voice was female, old, carrying power that made even the alphas pause their debate. Elder Talia stepped into the torchlight. The Silverpaw Pack's spiritual leader looked older than Liora remembered, more fragile, but her eyes burned with certainty that commanded attention. She addressed the council with respect, but no deference, reminding them that she'd been present at Liora's evaluation ceremony. That she'd sensed the suppression wards Liora's mother had placed and had recognized them for what they were, protection, not corruption. That she'd tried to warn Alpha Ronan that rejecting Liora would have consequences beyond pack politics. That the moon goddess's hand was evident in the girl's gifts, and rejecting her was rejecting divine will itself. Ronan's face went white, then red with barely contained fury. He accused Talia of senility, of being compromised by sympathy for a wolf who'd never belonged in Silverpaw to begin with, of betraying her own pack by defending an Omega over her Alpha. But Talia didn't back down. She told the council that she'd kept silent during the ceremony at Ronan's insistence, had allowed the rejection to proceed despite her misgivings because she'd believed the Alpha knew best. That she'd regretted that silence every day since, watching Liora be driven out and hunted while carrying gifts their kind desperately needed. That she was breaking her silence now because the council was about to make the same mistake Ronan had. Letting fear override wisdom, letting politics override divine mandate. That history would judge them harshly for destroying what they should have protected. The hall erupted into chaos. Alphas shouting over each other, some defending Ronan, others questioning whether Talia's testimony changed the evaluation. Beta Garrick stepped forward as if to physically remove the elder, but Damien moved to intercept him, his presence alone enough to make the Beta reconsider. And through it all, Liora stood in the center of that evaluation circle, her power still blazing from her hands, feeling the verdict shifting and changing like sand in a storm. She could see some of the Alphas wavering, reconsidering, looking at her with something other than pure hostility for the first time. But then the doors at the far end of the hall crashed open. What entered wasn't wolves. Wasn't anything natural or recognizable. Shadow given form, moving with predatory intent, reeking of the corruption Liora had seen in her visions at the sanctuary. 3 creatures that had once been wolves, but had been twisted by the darkness into something that defied description. Their eyes were black voids. Their forms flickered between solid and smoke. And the very air around them seemed to die, warmth and life draining away wherever they moved. The council hall erupted into absolute pandemonium. Alphas shifted immediately, their debate forgotten in the face of actual threat. Guards rushed forward. But the shadow creatures moved with impossible speed, targeting the weakest points in the hall's defenses, killing 3 guards before anyone could properly react. And then one of them locked onto Liora. It moved toward her with singular focus, drawn to her power like a moth to flame. She could feel its hunger, not for flesh, but for the divine gift she carried. It wanted to corrupt her, to consume her light and turn it into more darkness. To prove that even Mu-born gifts could be twisted if enough corruption was applied. Damien was there in an instant, his massive black wolf form intercepting the creature before it could reach her. His teeth closed on Shadow that felt wrong, that made him recoil even as he fought. The other Alphas engaged the remaining creatures, the hall becoming a battlefield in seconds. But Liora stood frozen in that evaluation circle, watching the scene unfold with horrible clarity. This was what Ronan had claimed she would become. This was what the prophecy warned about. This was the threat gathering at the borders, finally bold enough to strike at the heart of council territory. And she was the only one present who had the power to actually fight it. The decision made itself. Liora stopped trying to contain her gifts and let them explode outward with full force. Silver light blazed through the hall bright enough to banish every shadow, pure enough to make the corrupted creatures shriek with pain. She shaped the light into weapons, spears and arrows and waves of purifying fire, and drove them into the darkness with precision born of desperation and newly awakened instinct. The creatures tried to flee, but she wouldn't let them. Couldn't let them escape to report back to whatever master had sent them. She poured everything she had into eliminating the threat, her power burning so bright the Alphas had to look away or be blinded. When the light finally faded, 3 piles of ash marked where the shadow creatures had been. The hall was silent except for heavy breathing and the crackle of torches. Every eye was on Liora, standing in the center of that evaluation circle, her hands still glowing with residual power, her expression fierce with determination that hadn't been there an hour ago. She'd just saved them all. Proven beyond any doubt that her gifts weren't corruption, but exactly what was needed to fight the darkness threatening their world. And in their eyes, she could see that it changed nothing. Alpha Morrigan was the first to speak. Her voice was carefully neutral when she acknowledged that Liora's intervention had prevented significant loss of life, that her power had proven effective against the corruption. But that effectiveness itself was terrifying. That no single wolf should possess that much destructive capability without oversight and control. That the council would need to discuss appropriate measures to ensure Liora's gifts were used for protection rather than conquest. The word conquest hit like a slap. She'd just defended them, and they were already discussing how to chain her. Damien shifted back to human form, his voice raw with fury when he challenged the council. Asked them to see what was directly in front of their faces. That Liora was exactly what the prophecy had promised, that her gifts were the only thing standing between them and extinction, that their fear was going to doom them all. But fear was louder than logic, stronger than gratitude. The Alphas retreated into debate, discussing suppression and containment and proper oversight, as if the attack hadn't just proven everything Damien had been trying to tell them. And Liora understood with crushing certainty that it didn't matter what she did. Didn't matter that she'd saved them. Didn't matter that prophecy and divine will and desperate need all pointed to the same conclusion. They would never accept her. Would never trust her. Would always see her as a threat first and a person never. The mask had dropped. She'd seen behind their diplomatic words and proper protocols to the truth underneath. They would use her power when convenient, but they would never give her freedom or agency or respect. Would never let her be anything but a weapon they controlled. And she was done being what other people needed her to be. The silver light blazed brighter, responding to her rage and betrayal and the terrible understanding that she'd been foolish to hope for anything different. The Alphas backed away from the sudden surge of power, their expressions shifting from judgment to fear. Liora looked at each of them in turn. At Ronan, who'd orchestrated her downfall, at Morrigan, who'd pretended neutrality while supporting his lies, at the others who'd been so ready to condemn her. She told them with absolute certainty that they didn't deserve protection. Didn't deserve her gifts or her sacrifice or the destiny she'd been born to fulfill. That when the darkness came for them, and it would come, she hoped they remembered this moment. Hoped they understood that they'd destroyed their own salvation with their fear. Then she turned and walked out of the council hall. Not running this time. Not fleeing like prey. Walking with her head high and her power blazing around her like a cloak of living light, daring anyone to try stopping her. Damien was at her side immediately. He didn't speak, didn't try to change her mind or convince her to stay and plead her case. Just walked with her in silent solidarity, his presence steady and unwavering. Behind them, the council erupted into renewed chaos. But their voices faded as Liora crossed the boundary of council lands and kept moving. Away from judgment and fear and the bitter understanding that sometimes the monsters weren't the ones with darkness in their eyes. Sometimes the monsters were the ones who condemned what they couldn't understand, who destroyed what they couldn't control, who chose comfort over courage when the world needed heroes. And as the moon rose over the forest and silver light pulsed through her veins in rhythm with her heartbeat, Liora made a vow. She would survive. Would grow stronger. Would become exactly what they feared. And when the darkness finally came, when the prophecy demanded she stand between destruction and the packs who'd rejected her, she would make a choice. But it would be her choice. Made on her terms. For reasons that mattered to her rather than destiny or duty or the desperate needs of wolves who'd proven they valued their pride more than their survival. The betrayal burned. But beneath it, something else grew. Power. Purpose. And the terrible understanding that sometimes saving the world meant first learning to walk away from it. If you're feeling the weight of Liora's betrayal as deeply as she is, if you're ready to see what she becomes when she stops trying to save people who won't save themselves, then you need to be here for what comes next. 3 days passed in a strange suspension of time. 3 days where Liora and Damien existed in the bubble of Moonfell Sanctuary, training until her body screamed for mercy, pushing her gifts until the silver light responded to thought rather than emotion, learning to shape power into purpose instead of letting it shape her. 3 days where the outside world felt distant, theoretical, like maybe if they stayed here long enough the prophecy would forget about them and choose someone else. But prophecies didn't forget. And the darkness they warned about didn't wait for anyone to be ready. The message came with the evening wind. Not a physical scroll this time, but something older, carried through the ancient magic that saturated the sanctuary grounds. A disturbance that made every standing stone pulse, with warning light simultaneously. A ripple through reality itself that said the barriers were failing. That the darkness had finally breached pack territory. That wolves were dying. Damien felt it first. Liora watched his expression shift from focused instruction to something closer to horror. He stood frozen in the training circle they'd created near the innermost stones, his eyes distant, seeing something she couldn't. When he finally looked at her, the weight in his gaze made her stomach drop. He told her it had begun. That the creatures from her vision had broken through the weakened barriers at the northern borders. That 3 packs were under direct assault, Thornridge among them, along with 2 smaller territories that bordered the unclaimed lands. That the council had sent desperate calls for aid, but most alphas were too afraid to leave their own lands undefended. That the prophecy's moment had arrived whether she was ready or not. Liora felt her hands start shaking. 3 days of training wasn't enough. She could control the silver light now, could shape it into barriers and weapons and focus beams of purifying energy. But she hadn't tested it against actual corruption, hadn't faced the creatures that fed on pack bonds and twisted wolves into monsters. 3 days of practice against imaginary threats suddenly felt pathetically insufficient. She told Damien she wasn't ready, that she'd barely scratched the surface of understanding her gifts, that sending her against an army of those things would be suicide dressed up as heroism. Damien's expression softened but didn't waver. He told her she would never feel ready. That readiness was a myth people told themselves while waiting for courage to arrive. That the wolves dying at the northern border didn't care whether she felt prepared. They just needed someone to stand between them and annihilation. That she was the only one who could. The truth of it settled into her bones with crushing weight. This was what she'd chosen when she'd told him she wouldn't run. When she'd decided her existence needed to mean something. The reality just looked different than she'd imagined, less noble, more terrifying, carrying the very real possibility that she would die trying to save people who'd wanted her dead just days ago. But dying here while people suffered when she had the power to help felt worse than dying while trying. She asked him what the plan was. How they would reach the northern territories before the creatures devoured everything. How she was supposed to fight an army when she was just one person with barely controlled gifts and a prophecy that might be nothing but wishful thinking carved into stone 3 centuries ago. Damien told her they wouldn't be going alone. That his authority as Alpha King still carried weight with some of the older packs, the ones who remembered what the title actually meant. That he'd sent word the moment he'd felt her power awaken, calling in debts and alliances that predated the modern territorial system. That loyal wolves had been gathering at strategic points, waiting for the signal to move. That she would have an army at her back. Small, perhaps. Outnumbered almost certainly. But not alone. The knowledge helped. Slightly. Liora looked down at her hands where silver light pulsed in steady rhythm with her heartbeat. She'd spent 3 days learning to be a weapon. Now it was time to discover if she could actually be wielded without breaking herself in the process. They left the sanctuary as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire that felt uncomfortably prophetic. The standing stones pulsed brighter as they passed through each circle, like they were trying to hold on to her, to keep her in this place of safety and ancient magic. But safety was an illusion when the world was burning. And ancient magic meant nothing if there was no one left alive to remember why it mattered. Damien led her through paths that bent distance in ways that shouldn't be possible, using roads that existed in the spaces between territories where reality grew thin. They moved with impossible speed, covering ground that should have taken days in mere hours. His Alpha King authority opened doors most shifters didn't know existed, shortcuts through the fabric of their world that had been sealed since the last time the packs stood united. And as they traveled, wolves began to emerge from the shadows to join them. Not many. 24 at most, drawn from packs scattered across 5 territories. But these weren't ordinary pack wolves following orders. These were believers. Older shifters who remembered the stories about Moo-born power and alpha kings who served something greater than territorial ambition. Younger wolves who'd watched their world fracture and had been waiting desperately for someone to show them another way. They fell in behind Damien and Liora without question, without demands for proof or explanations. They'd felt the darkness touching their borders. They'd seen what it did to wolves who got too close. And they'd rather die fighting beside a prophesied Moo-born than watch their packs be consumed while doing nothing. Liora felt their presence like a physical weight. These wolves were following her into battle. They would die or survive based on her choices, her strength, her ability to be what the prophecy claimed. The responsibility made her chest tight, made breathing feel difficult, made every step toward the northern border feel like walking toward her own execution. But she kept walking anyway, because stopping wasn't an option. Because these wolves deserved a leader who didn't flee when things got hard. Because somewhere ahead, pack members were dying while she wrestled with fear that mattered to no one but herself. They reached the border as full darkness fell. And Liora understood immediately that no amount of training could have prepared her for what waited there. The corruption had manifested physically. What should have been forest was now something else, trees twisted into shapes that hurt to look at, their bark weeping black ichor that burned the ground where it fell. The air itself was wrong, thick and oily, carrying a stench like rotting meat and despair given physical form. And moving through that perverted landscape were the creatures from her vision. They'd once been wolves. That much was clear from their basic structure. But the darkness had reshaped them into parodies of what they'd been. Too many limbs. Eyes that leaked shadow instead of tears. Mouths that opened in directions anatomy shouldn't allow. They moved in packs, terrible irony there, hunting down the few remaining defenders who still fought to hold the border. And there were so many of them. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. Far more than Liora had seen in her vision. The darkness hadn't just breached the barrier. It had poured through in a flood that threatened to drown everything. The 24 wolves at her back suddenly felt laughably insufficient. Like bringing a candle to fight the ocean. Like everything they were about to attempt was futile gesture meant only to make them feel like they'd tried before the inevitable end. But then Damien's hand found hers. Warm. Solid. Real. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. The simple contact was reminder enough. She wasn't the girl who'd been rejected and banished anymore. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't beneath notice. She carried the accumulated power of generations of Moo-born women who'd stood against impossible odds and had refused to break. And she had him beside her. Had chosen to stand with him. Had kissed him beside a fire in an ancient sanctuary and had felt something shift in the universe, like maybe they were supposed to be doing this together. Liora took a breath that tasted of corruption and rot and drew on every lesson from the past 3 days. The silver light responded immediately, blazing to visibility beneath her skin, bright enough to push back the oily darkness that tried to press against them. She could feel her power wanting to explode outward, to purge everything wrong from this place in one catastrophic release. But catastrophic releases were what had gotten Moo-born women killed in the past. Burning too bright too fast until there was nothing left. She needed to be smarter than that. Needed to be sustainable. Needed to last long enough to actually make a difference. She shaped the power instead. Focused it. Let it flow through her in controlled streams rather than explosive bursts. And then she pushed it outward toward the corrupted forest, toward the creatures that prowled there, toward the darkness that had poisoned pack lands and turned wolves into monsters. The silver light hit the corruption like purifying fire meeting oil. The creatures shrieked sounds that shouldn't come from anything living and recoiled from the barrier she was creating. The twisted trees caught the light and began to straighten, their bark healing, the black ichor drying up like it had never existed. The air cleared enough to breathe without tasting death. And the pack wolves who'd been fighting a desperate holding action saw what was happening and howled. Not in fear this time. In hope. In defiance. In the bone-deep recognition that something had finally shifted in their favor. Damien shifted to his massive black wolf form and charged. The 24 wolves who'd followed them did the same, throwing themselves into battle with renewed fury. And Liora stood at the boundary line between corrupted and clean territory, pouring power into maintaining the barrier, pushing it forward inch by agonizing inch, reclaiming ground that the darkness had claimed. The battle became something out of nightmare and legend tangled together. Corrupted creatures threw themselves against her barrier only to burn to ash where they touched the silver light. Pack wolves tore into the monsters with claws and teeth and desperate courage, fighting not for territory or dominance, but for the simple right to survive. And Damien moved through it all like death given fur and fangs, his alpha king power amplifying every wolf who fought beside him, turning a small force into something that could actually contest the corrupted horde. But there were too many. For every creature they destroyed, 3 more emerged from the poisoned forest. The corruption kept spreading around the edges of Liora's barrier, looking for weaknesses, trying to flank them, searching for the moment when her concentration would slip and the purifying light would fail. And Liora could feel her reserves depleting. 3 days of training hadn't built the kind of endurance she needed for this. The power was there, vast, ancient, deep enough to reshape the world if she let it. But channeling that much energy through her mortal body was like trying to funnel an ocean through a reed. She was burning through strength she didn't have, maintaining power she couldn't sustain. She was going to fail. These wolves would die because she wasn't enough. The prophecy had been wrong, or she was the wrong person, or 3 days of training would never be sufficient for what the darkness demanded. The barrier flickered. Just for a heartbeat. But the creatures noticed. They surged forward, sensing weakness, their shrieks rising into a crescendo that spoke of victory and feeding and the end of everything the wolves had tried to build. And then Elder Talia appeared. The Silverpaw Pack's spiritual leader stepped out of the forest behind Liora, moving with a grace that belied her age. She wasn't alone. 3 other elders from neighboring packs accompanied her, each one bearing the marks of long service and deep connection to the old ways. They'd come despite the council's denouncement, despite their alpha's fears, because they remembered what Moo-born gifts actually meant. Talia told Liora to stop trying to hold everything alone. That Moo-born power was meant to be anchored by those who served the goddess, that the ancient partnerships between priestesses and spiritual leaders existed for exactly this reason. That she needed to trust them to help carry the weight. The 4 elders formed a circle around Liora, their hands raised, their voices rising in chants that predated the modern packs. And Liora felt something shift, like channels opening, like the river of power she'd been trying to control suddenly had proper banks to flow through. The elders weren't adding their own power, they were helping her direct hers, shaping it, focusing it, letting her be the source while they became the vessel. The barrier exploded outward. Not wild and uncontrolled, but precise and devastating. Silver light swept across the battlefield like a wave of liquid moonlight, touching every corrupted creature, burning away the darkness that animated them, reducing them to ash that scattered on wind that suddenly smelled clean again. The poisoned forest couldn't withstand the assault, trees straightened, bark healed, the ground itself purged the corruption that had seeped into it. And in the center of that purifying storm, Liora burned like a star given flesh. The silver light blazed from every pore, so bright the pack wolves had to look away or be blinded. Power flowed through her in torrents that should have killed her but somehow didn't, held together by the elders chanting and her own desperate will and something else, some deeper connection to the prophecy itself. Like the sanctuary had awakened more than just her gifts when she'd walked into that temple. The creatures fled. Those that could still move anyway. They melted back into the spaces between territories, into the darkness that had spawned them, retreating from light that promised nothing but annihilation. The corrupted forest receded, the boundary of poison land shrinking back toward wherever the breach had originated. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack ended. The creatures were gone. The forest was clean. The only sounds were the ragged breathing of exhausted wolves and the dying crackle of fires started by the battle. Liora's barrier collapsed. The silver light that had been blazing from her skin flickered and faded, sinking back beneath the surface, leaving her standing there swaying on legs that no longer wanted to hold her weight. The elders caught her before she could fall, supporting her between them, their expressions showing both satisfaction and concern. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. She'd held back the darkness and saved the pack wolves who'd been fighting a losing battle and proven that maybe, just maybe, the prophecy wasn't just empty words carved by desperate people who'd seen their world ending. Damien shifted back to human form and moved to her side immediately. Blood covered him from wounds he'd taken during the fighting, but his eyes were clear and focused entirely on her. He asked if she was all right, his hands checking her for injuries she didn't have, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't bothering to hide. She told him she was fine. Exhausted. Terrified. But fine. And then she asked the question that mattered. Had they stopped it? Had they pushed the darkness back enough to give the packs time to regroup? Damien's expression grew troubled. He told her they'd won this battle. Saved these 3 territories from immediate destruction. But the corruption source was still out there, still feeding, still growing. What they'd fought tonight was a probing attack, the darkness testing defenses, measuring resistance, determining how much force would be needed to finish the job. The real war hadn't started yet. This had been the warning shot. Liora felt something inside her harden at his words. Fine. Let the darkness bring its real assault. She'd been forged in rejection and humiliation and 3 days of brutal training. She'd killed to survive. She'd claimed power that terrified everyone who saw it. She'd stood on a battlefield and had refused to break when everything rational said she should have fled. She wasn't the scared Omega anymore. Wasn't the girl who'd run through a storm with hunting parties at her heels. She was whatever the prophecy had promised she would become, not because destiny demanded it, but because she'd chosen it. Because these wolves deserve someone willing to burn themselves out holding back the dark. Because she'd rather die standing than live as what the packs had tried to make her. The pack wolves who'd survived the battle began emerging from cover, drawn by the sudden absence of corruption, their expressions shifting from desperate survival mode to something like wonder. They'd watched her light up the battlefield. They'd seen what Moo-born power could actually do when channeled properly. They'd witnessed prophecy made manifest. And they knelt. Every single one of them. Not just the 24 who'd followed Damien and Liora here, but the defenders from Thornridge and the other territories, the wolves who'd been fighting alone against impossible odds. They knelt in the clean forest and they bowed their heads and they acknowledged what stood before them. Not an Omega. Not a cursed reject. Not an abomination to be eliminated. A Moo-born daughter who'd just saved their lives. Liora looked at them, at wolves from packs who'd wanted her dead, who'd called her dangerous, who'd spread warnings about the forbidden power she carried. And she felt rage and satisfaction twist together into something cold and sharp. She'd saved them. She'd bled power and will and desperate courage to give them another day of existence. And they knelt because they finally understood what she could have told them from the beginning. She wasn't the threat. The darkness was. And they'd wasted precious time trying to eliminate the only weapon that could actually fight it. She told them to stand up. Her voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by exhaustion and emotion too complex to name. She told them she hadn't done this so they could grovel. She'd done it because the alternative was watching wolves die while she hid behind fear of what using her power might cost. But if they truly wanted to honor what she'd done tonight, they could take a message back to their alphas and the council. The prophecy was real. The Moo-born bloodline still existed. And the darkness wouldn't be defeated by packs fighting separately, by territories protecting their own borders while their neighbors burned. They would stand united or they would fall divided. There was no middle ground. No compromise position. The creatures didn't care about pack politics or territorial disputes or ancient grudges. They only cared about feeding. And fractured wolves made easy prey. The message hung in the night air, delivered not as plea but as statement of fact. The wolves who'd knelt slowly stood, understanding settling into their expressions. Some looked ashamed. These were the ones who'd spread word that she was dangerous, who'd supported hunting her down. Others looked determined. Ready to carry her words back to alphas who needed to hear truth whether they wanted to or not. And a few looked at her with something else. something that made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Not fear exactly. More like recognition. Like they'd seen something in her performance tonight that went beyond simple power. Something that spoke to the darker parts of the prophecy. The warnings about what Moonborn daughters could become if pushed too far, if given too many reasons to stop caring about the wolves they were supposed to protect. She'd save them tonight. But prophecies always carried edges that cut both ways. And the power she'd wielded so carefully could just as easily be turned to destruction if she ever decided the packs weren't worth saving. Damien moved closer, his hand finding the small of her back, grounding her before that thought could spiral into something darker. He told the assembled wolves to make camp. That they would rest here tonight, recover strength, tend wounds. That in the morning, messengers would carry word of what happened to every pack that would listen. That the Alpha King and the Moonborn daughter would stand together at the center of whatever came next. The wolves dispersed to follow orders, moving with the practiced efficiency of survivors who'd learned not to waste time after battle. The elders remained close to Liora, their weathered faces showing concern for her exhaustion, but also satisfaction that their ancient knowledge had proven useful. Elder Talia especially watched her with an expression that mixed pride and worry in equal measure. The old woman told Liora she'd done well. More than well. She'd become what the prophecy described. A bridge between the old magic and the modern world, powerful enough to hold back forces that would consume them all. But Talia also warned her to be careful. That power like hers attracted attention from more than just the darkness. That there were those who would try to control her, to turn her gifts to purposes that served their own ambitions rather than the greater good. That she needed to remember why she fought even when the wolves she protected gave her reasons to stop. The warning settled into Liora's bones alongside the exhaustion. She thanked the elders for their help, for stepping forward when the council had condemned her, for remembering what Moonborn power was actually meant for. And then she let Damien guide her to the edge of the makeshift camp where they could have a moment of relative privacy. She collapsed against a tree that had been corrupted an hour ago and was now clean, its bark rough and real against her back. Every muscle screamed. Her head throbbed from channeling that much power. Her hands shook with aftershocks of the silver light that had burned through her veins. But underneath the physical exhaustion, she felt something else. Satisfaction. Purpose. The bone-deep knowledge that she'd made a difference tonight. That wolves were breathing because she'd refused to let fear stop her from doing what needed to be done. She'd become what they'd feared. And in becoming it, she'd save them. The irony wasn't lost on her. Damien settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, his presence steady and warm in the cool night air. He didn't say anything at first. Just sat there with her while she processed what had happened, what it meant, what would come next. Finally, she broke the silence. Asked him if this was what it would be like from now on. Fighting battles across the territories, pushing back darkness, while the packs she saved looked at her with that mix of gratitude and fear. Never quite accepted. Never quite trusted. Always necessary but never truly wanted. Damien was quiet for a moment before responding. He told her he wouldn't lie and promise it would get easier. That the packs were fractured and suspicious and would resist unity even as it became their only path to survival. That there would be alphas who tried to use her, council members who tried to control her, wolves who saw her power as threat even after she'd saved their lives. But he also told her she wouldn't face it alone. That he'd spent 20 years searching for her specifically so she wouldn't have to carry this burden in isolation the way previous Moonborn had. That whatever came next, they would face it together, as partners, as allies, as something more that they were still figuring out, but that felt right in ways that defied logic. That she was worth standing beside even when, especially when, the entire world tried to tear them apart. His words wrapped around her exhausted soul like a blanket. Liora let her head rest against his shoulder, let herself take this moment of peace before the next crisis arrived. Around them, wolves tended wounds and built fires and tried to find comfort in the knowledge that they'd survived something that should have killed them. And in the forest beyond the camp, in the spaces between territories where corruption still lurked, the darkness watched. Measured. Planned. Tonight had been a test. The Moonborn daughter had revealed her hand, shown what she could do when properly anchored and supported. Now the true assault could be tailored to her specific weaknesses. The creatures could evolve. The corruption could adapt. And the next time it struck, it would come with everything, ready to either break her completely or consume her light and turn it to shadow. The war had begun. And Liora, former Omega of the Silverpaw Pack, banished and rejected and transformed by her own desperate need to survive, stood at its center whether she wanted to or not. But tonight, in this moment, she let herself rest. Let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, being what everyone feared would be enough to save them all. Even if saving them meant destroying herself in the process. The dawn came too quickly. Liora awoke to find herself still leaning against Damien, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, both of them having fallen asleep sitting upright against that cleansed tree. Around them, the camp was already stirring, wolves preparing to depart, messengers gathering their courage to carry impossible news back to alphas who wouldn't want to hear it, survivors checking on pack mates who'd fought beside them through the longest night of their lives. Everything looked normal in the morning light. The forest was just forest again, green and alive, showing no trace of the corruption that had twisted it into nightmare just hours ago. Birds sang in the branches. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and earth and new beginnings. But Liora could still feel the darkness lurking at the edges. Could sense it watching from the spaces between territories, from the places where reality grew thin and ancient things prowled. Last night had been a battle. A victory, yes. But not the war. Never the war. The war was just beginning. Damien stirred beside her, his eyes opening to meet hers immediately, like even in sleep he'd remained aware of her presence. He looked tired, bone-tired, the kind that came from carrying weight for too long with no relief in sight. But when he looked at her, something in his expression softened. Something that spoke of finding exactly what he'd been searching for, even if it came wrapped in complications he'd never anticipated. He asked her how she felt. Not just physically, though that mattered too, but how she felt about what had happened. About what came next. About standing at the center of a prophecy that would demand everything she had and possibly more. Liora took a moment to actually consider the question instead of deflecting with platitudes. How did she feel? Exhausted. Terrified. Powerful in ways that still unsettled her. Angry at packs who'd condemned her and now needed her. Grateful for wolves like the elders who'd stepped forward despite the risk. Uncertain about whether she could sustain this, the fighting, the responsibility, the weight of carrying so many lives on shoulders that still felt too young, too unprepared. But underneath all of that, beneath the fear and doubt and complexity, she felt something else. Something that had been growing since the moment she'd run through that storm with a hunting party at her heels. Since she'd felt silver light explode from her hands in a clearing of ancient stones. Since she'd chosen to stand instead of flee. She felt alive. Truly, completely alive in ways she'd never been when she was trying to make herself small enough for the Silverpaw Pack to accept. The danger and uncertainty and impossible odds had stripped away everything false, everything performative, everything that wasn't absolutely essential to who she actually was beneath all the layers of shame and suppression. She was done apologizing for existing. Done trying to earn acceptance from wolves who would only see her as threat or tool. Done making herself less so others could feel more comfortable. If they wanted her power, they would have to accept all of her. The strength in the danger and the refusal to be controlled. If they wanted her protection, they would have to trust her judgment even when it frightened them. If they wanted the prophecy fulfilled, they would have to let her fulfill it on her own terms. She told Damien she felt ready. Not for everything, she'd probably never feel ready for everything. But ready for the next step. Ready to face whatever the council would throw at her when word of last night reached them. Ready to stand before alphas who wanted her eliminated and make them understand that elimination was no longer an option. That she was here. She was powerful. And she was done being afraid of what that meant. Damien's expression shifted into something that looked like pride mixed with concern. He told her the council would try to bind her. would demand oaths and restrictions and oversight that would effectively neuter her ability to act independently. They would use fear of what she could become to justify controlling what she currently was. They would frame it as protection for her, for the packs, for everyone, but the truth would be simpler. They were terrified of power they couldn't command. And they would do everything possible to ensure she never became more dangerous to them than the darkness she was supposed to fight. The warning should have made her hesitate. Should have made her reconsider, retreat, maybe disappear into the unclaimed lands where council authority couldn't reach. A week ago, 3 days ago, she might have done exactly that. Might have chosen safety over confrontation, anonymity over standing in the light where everyone could see exactly what she'd become. But that girl was gone. Burned away in silver fire and prophecy made manifest. What remained was someone who'd looked at an army of corrupted creatures and had refused to blink. Someone who'd channeled enough power to reshape a battlefield and had survived the experience. Someone who'd been called abomination and cursed and unworthy and had decided those words said more about the speakers than about her. She told Damien to let them try. Let the council attempt to bind her, to control her, to make her into something manageable and safe. She would stand before them, and she would show them exactly what trying to cage a newborn daughter would cost. Not through violence, she wasn't interested in proving their fears correct, but through simple, undeniable demonstration of the fact that the prophecy hadn't promised them a weapon they could wield. It had promised them a force of nature they could either stand beside or be swept away by. The choice was theirs. The camp dispersed as the morning wore on. Messengers departed carrying word of the battle and its outcome to every pack that would listen. The elders returned to their own territories, promising to work on convincing their spiritual leaders that supporting Liora was necessary for survival. The wolves who'd fought beside them melted back into the forest, forever changed by what they'd witnessed, carrying stories that would spread whether the alphas wanted them to or not. And Damien and Liora stood at the center of the abandoned battlefield, looking at ground that had been poisoned and was now clean, both knowing that this momentary peace was illusion. The darkness would return. Stronger. Smarter. Adapted to counter what she'd done here. The prophecy had promised she would stand between the packs and annihilation. It hadn't promised she would survive the standing. Damien asked her one more time if she was certain. If she truly wanted to walk this path knowing where it led. Knowing that the packs might never accept her, that the council would fight her every step, that the darkness would eventually evolve past her ability to contain it. Knowing that the most likely outcome was death. Either in battle against creatures that fed on divine power, or from burning herself out trying to channel more than her mortal body could sustain. He told her he would support whatever choice she made. If she wanted to fight, he would stand beside her until the end. If she wanted to flee, he would help her disappear and would face the consequences alone. If she wanted something in between, some compromise that let her live while others died. He wouldn't judge her for choosing herself over prophecy. That she didn't owe the packs anything. Not after what they'd done to her. Not after the rejection and banishment and hunting parties and council denouncement. That saving them would be choice, not obligation. And that choosing not to save them would be completely understandable given everything. Liora looked at him. This man who'd lost everything to the darkness, who'd spent 20 years searching for a solution, who'd found her and had offered protection and training and something that felt dangerously like love even though neither of them had said the word aloud. She saw the hope in his eyes. The desperate, fragile hope that maybe she would choose to fight. That maybe together they could actually make a difference. But she also saw the acceptance. The understanding that if she walked away, he would let her go. Would honor her choice even if it destroyed him. Would spend the rest of his life fighting alone against inevitable defeat because that's what he'd been doing anyway before she came along. And Liora understood something fundamental in that moment. She wasn't fighting for the packs. Wasn't trying to save wolves who'd wanted her dead. Wasn't proving anything to alphas or council members or anyone else who'd ever looked at her and found her lacking. She was fighting because the alternative was unacceptable. Because letting the darkness win meant watching it consume everything, including the few people who'd ever seen her as more than her rank or her power. People like Elder Talia who'd spoken truth when it was dangerous. Like the elders who'd anchored her power when she would have burned out. Like Damien, who'd offered her choices when everyone else had tried to eliminate them. She was fighting because some things were worth protecting even when the people you were protecting didn't deserve it. Because the world contained beauty and connection and possibility alongside all the cruelty and rejection. Because giving up meant letting the darkness define the ending, and she was done letting others write her story. She told Damien she would stand. Would face the council and the alphas and whatever the darkness threw at her next. Would burn as bright and as long as she could because someone had to and it might as well be her. Would accept that it would probably kill her eventually, but that dying while fighting for something that mattered felt better than surviving by hiding from everything that scared her. And she told him one more thing. Something she'd been feeling since that kiss beside the fire in Moonfell Sanctuary, but hadn't had the courage to voice aloud. She told him she loved him. Not because he was Alpha King or because he'd saved her or because he'd trained her gifts. But because he'd looked at her when she was nothing and had seen everything. Because he'd offered her choices instead of commands. Because he carried grief that would have destroyed most wolves and had turned it into purpose that gave meaning to survival. Because standing beside him felt like home in ways the Silverpaw Pack never had. The confession hung in the morning air between them. Damien's expression cracked, just for a moment, just enough for her to see the raw emotion beneath the controlled exterior. He pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her like he could shield her from everything coming, his face pressed into her hair, his voice rough when he finally spoke. He told her he loved her too. That he'd been falling since the moment he'd stepped into that clearing and had seen her kneeling in the mud with silver light blazing from her hands. That she was fierce and terrifying and more powerful than she understood, and that watching her become what the prophecy promised was both his greatest hope and his deepest fear. That he would stand beside her until the darkness took them both. And that if they survived, against all odds, against prophecy's typical endings, he wanted to build something beyond war and duty. Wanted to explore what they could be when the fighting finally ended and they were just two people who'd found each other in the ruins of everything. Liora held on to him and let herself believe in that future even knowing how unlikely it was. Let herself imagine a world where prophecies were fulfilled and darkness was defeated and two broken people who'd chosen each other got to exist without the weight of destiny crushing down on them. It was probably fantasy. Probably impossible. But it was hers. And she would fight for it with the same fierce determination she'd fight for everything else worth protecting. They left the battlefield as the sun climbed higher, following paths that would lead them to neutral ground where the council would be forced to meet them. Word had already spread. Liora could feel it in the way the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, in the distant howls that carried news from pack to pack, in the shift of atmosphere that said the shifter world was collectively realizing that everything had changed. The Moonborn daughter was real. The prophecy was unfolding. And the comfortable lies they'd told themselves about power and hierarchy and natural order were crumbling in the face of silver light that purged corruption and ancient gifts that refused to be suppressed. Some would accept it, would bend to necessity and would stand with her against the darkness because survival demanded it. Others would resist, would fight to maintain control even as their world burned. Would see her as greater threat than the creatures because at least the creatures were honest about wanting to destroy them. And that divide, that fundamental choice between accepting help that came wrapped in power they couldn't command versus clinging to authority that was proving insufficient, would determine whether the shifter world survived what was coming. Liora understood now what the prophecy had actually meant. She wasn't just supposed to fight the darkness. She was supposed to shatter the old hierarchies, to prove that divine power trumped alpha dominance, to force the packs to either evolve or go extinct. She was the crisis as much as she was the solution. The thing that would either forge them into something stronger or would watch them fracture beyond repair. And the most terrifying part? She was fine with either outcome. If they chose to stand with her, to trust her judgment, to accept that Mu-born authority predated their modern power structures, then she would burn herself out protecting them. Would stand between them and annihilation until there was nothing left of her but ash and the memory of silver light. But if they chose to fight her, to try caging or controlling or eliminating her, then she would let the darkness have them. Would step back and would watch their pride consume them. Would save only those who deserved saving and would let the rest learn the hard way that some forces of nature couldn't be commanded. The prophecy had called her their salvation. But prophecies were interpreted by those who needed to believe in them. And maybe, just maybe, salvation looked different depending on which side of the divide you stood on. Somewhere in the distance, a howl rose into the morning air. Then another. Then a dozen more, spreading across territories like wildfire, carrying a message that would reach every pack by nightfall. The moon-born daughter had risen. She'd faced the darkness and had pushed it back. She'd saved wolves who'd condemned her and had proven that prophecy was more than wishful thinking carved into ancient stone. And now she was coming for the council. Coming to demand they choose. Coming to shatter comfortable illusions. Coming to show them exactly what they'd created when they'd driven her out, when they'd tried to suppress what she was, when they'd valued their authority over the survival of their species. Some would kneel. Would recognize power when it stood before them blazing with purpose, and would accept that the old ways were dead and something new was being born from their ashes. Others would resist. Would fight until fighting cost them everything. Would learn too late that trying to cage prophecy only ever ended one way. And Liora, former Omega, banished daughter, Mu-born weapon who'd chosen her own purpose, would let them make that choice. Would give them agency even if they'd never given it to her. Would stand in the center of their crisis and would let their response define whether she saved them or watched them burn. Because in the end, that's what the prophecy had actually promised. Not a savior who would rescue them from their own failures, but a reckoning who would force them to confront exactly what they'd become. A mirror held up to every cruel rejection, every suppressed gift, every wolf they deemed unworthy, because acknowledging worth would have threatened their comfortable hierarchies. She was their salvation only if they were willing to be saved. Their destruction if they chose pride over survival. Their judgment rendered in silver fire and ancient power. And the most beautiful part? She was completely at peace with whichever path they chose. The girl who'd stood in a ceremonial clearing and had let herself be rejected was gone. Burned away in the crucible of transformation that came from having nothing left to lose. What remained was someone who'd learned the most dangerous lesson prophecy could teach. That being powerful enough to save everyone meant being powerful enough to destroy them too. And that the line between savior and reckoning was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. That maybe, just maybe, they were the same thing viewed from different angles. She was the prophecy fulfilled. The answer to prayers they'd stopped believing in. The nightmare they'd created by suppressing divine gifts for generations. She was salvation and reckoning wrapped in silver fire and mortal flesh. Standing at the crossroads where their world would either transform or end. Offering her hand to those brave enough to take it. Offering nothing but honest watching to those who weren't. And she was done apologizing for any of it. So here's the question that matters. The one you need to ask yourself as you listen to her story unfold. As you watch her transform from rejected Omega into something that makes even Alpha Kings step back in recognition. Would you have chosen her side? When she stood in that council chamber with silver light blazing from her hands, power enough to level the building radiating from her very presence, prophecy made manifest in ways that terrified everyone who witnessed it, would you have knelt? Would you have recognized salvation when it came wrapped in the form they'd tried so hard to eliminate? Or would you have been among those who resisted? Who saw her power and felt only fear? Who valued control over survival and would rather die clinging to outdated hierarchies than live in a world where divine authority trumped political ambition? Would you have trusted the Mu-born daughter? Or would you have been another voice calling for her elimination right up until the darkness swallowed you whole? It's easy to say you'd have chosen correctly when you know how the story unfolds. Easy to claim you'd have seen her worth when you're listening safe and comfortable, removed from the visceral terror of watching everything you thought you knew about power and hierarchy crumble in real time. But the truth is harder. The truth is that most would have been afraid. Most would have chosen the comfortable lie over the dangerous truth. Most would have condemned her right up until the moment they needed her, and maybe even after. Because that's what happens when prophecy walks into the room. When salvation arrives wearing a face you didn't expect, carrying power you can't control, demanding you evolve or step aside. Most people choose fear. Choose control. Choose the devil they know over the savior they can't command. And Liora? She'd made peace with that. Had accepted that she could only save those willing to be saved. That the rest would become casualties of their own stubbornness, their own fear, their own inability to recognize that the world had already changed and they could either change with it or be left behind. She was the prophecy fulfilled. The moonborn daughter risen. The reckoning the Pax had created through generations of suppressing what they should have protected. And whether you would have chosen her side or not doesn't change what's coming. Doesn't alter the fact that she's standing at the center of everything, silver fire in her veins and ancient purpose driving every choice, ready to either save them all or watch them burn. The darkness is coming. The final battle approaches. And Liora stands ready, not because she's fearless, but because she's done being afraid. Not because she's certain of victory, but because fighting is the only choice that lets her live with herself. Not because the Pax deserve her protection, but because some things are worth defending even when the people you're defending don't deserve it. She's the answer to a prayer they stopped believing in. The weapon they tried to eliminate before it could be turned against them. The savior and the reckoning and the judgment all wrapped in one fierce, terrifying, beautiful package. And she's done apologizing for any of it. If this story has burned itself into your mind, if you can feel Liora's power thrumming in your veins, if you understand now what it means to be rejected and to rise anyway, if you're ready to see what happens when prophecy collides with pride and power reshapes the world, then you know what comes next. Subscribe to Shayla's Romance Library. Hit that button. Join us. Because this is where we tell stories that don't just entertain, they transform. Where rejection becomes power and weakness becomes strength and broken girls become the weapons that save or destroy worlds depending on how they're treated. This is where prophecy lives. Where fierce women claim power that terrifies everyone around them and refuse to apologize. Where love defies destiny and destiny bends to will, and will is the only thing that matters when the darkness comes calling. Liora's story isn't finished. The council still waits. The darkness still gathers. The final battle approaches and no one, not Liora, not Damien, not the Pax who condemned her knows how it ends. Whether she becomes the salvation they need or the reckoning they deserve. Whether love survives when prophecy demands everything. Whether standing between the world and annihilation means sacrificing the person you fought so hard to become. But that's a story for another day. Another chapter. Another moment when you need to remember what it feels like to be powerful and terrifying and absolutely done apologizing for existing. So subscribe. Because at Shayla's Romance Library, we don't tell safe stories. We tell true ones. We tell stories about women who rise from rejection and become forces of nature. About power that demands to be acknowledged. About prophecies that shatter comfortable lies and force everyone to choose who they really are when the world is ending. We tell stories that burn. And if you're still here, if you've listened this long, if Liora's fire has kindled something in your own chest that refuses to be extinguished, then you're already one of us. Welcome to the library. Welcome to the place where fierce women claim their power and refuse to be diminished. Welcome to stories that change you, that challenge you, that remind you what it feels like to burn bright enough to reshape the world. Liora's waiting. The prophecy's unfolding. The darkness is coming. And we'll be here, telling the story of what happens when a rejected Omega becomes the reckoning the Pax created through their own cruelty and fear. Subscribe. Because this is just the beginning. And the best stories? They're the ones that burn long after the telling ends.